I moved to Bar Harbor, Maine, just to wipe them completely from my mind. I moved to start over. My ex-wife, Eleanor, remarried just 3 weeks after our divorce papers were finalized. She called her new man a visionary pioneer, a multimillionaire private equity tycoon, and my own son, Julian, looked me dead in the eye and told me he was going to be the best man at their wedding because he had finally found a father figure who actually knew how to move capital. They thought I was finished. They thought I was just a retired, old-school structural engineer with nothing left but a modest pension and a broken heart. They couldn't have been more wrong. At their lavish Hamptons wedding reception, a man who wasn't even on the guest list stood up, said just one sentence, and caused Eleanor to let out a scream I will never forget. Then, at 2 in the morning, my phone rang. But before I tell you how sweet that moment of accountability really was, I need to take you back to the exact second everything shattered. My name is Arthur Pendleton. I'm 68 years old, and for 40 years, I worked as a chief structural engineer. I've laid the foundations for New York's skyscrapers, designed the load-bearing solutions for Boston's cross-harbor bridges, and even personally reinforced the very courthouse that just dismantled my life. If you've ever given absolutely everything to people who only viewed you as a walking ATM, you know exactly how this feels. That afternoon, the asphalt in the Boston courthouse parking lot was radiating a suffocating heat, but I felt completely frozen. In my hand, I held the keys to my 1969 vintage Porsche 911. That car was paid for with countless late nights reviewing blueprints, bought with hands covered in concrete dust, and painstakingly restored piece by piece in my own garage. In a lifetime of strict budgeting, it was the single luxury I ever allowed myself to own. Before I could even press the unlock button, a manicured hand with deep burgundy acrylic nails snatched the keys right out of my palm. It was Eleanor. At 62, she was still an attractive woman, but the sheer ugliness of her greed was starting to break through her heavy foundation. She dangled the keys in front of my face like she was teasing a stray dog. She smirked, speaking loud enough to draw looks from passing lawyers, telling me not to be so pathetic. She reminded me that the judge awarded her the car, along with our historic Back Bay brownstone and 60% of our investment portfolio. She told me an old man didn't need a vintage sports car just to drive to the local library. I stood there, my empty hands still suspended in the air. This wasn't even about the car anymore. It was about pure, unadulterated contempt. I kept my voice low and steady, telling her that I personally tuned that engine, that I knew every single bolt on the chassis, and that she didn't even know what grade of fuel it took. She let out a sharp, piercing laugh. She told me that was the beauty of money, something she claimed I would never understand. She mocked me for liking to get my hands dirty and thinking small, saying that her new man, Harrison, didn't fix cars. He bought dealerships. To her, that was the difference between a laborer and an emperor. Harrison. The name tasted like poison in my mouth. He was the man she had been seeing behind my back for 6 months, the man she was now discarding me for. I took a deep breath, fighting the urge to take my keys back. I am a man of logic. My world is built on stress points, load capacities, and structural integrity. If you overload a steel beam, it snaps. Eleanor was overloading me, but I refused to break, not here and certainly not in front of a crowd. I simply told her to enjoy the drive and to remember to change the oil regularly. She rolled her eyes, reached into her expensive designer bag, and flicked a piece of plastic right at my chest. It bounced off my tie and landed in a puddle on the asphalt. She smiled derived pleasure from it, saying she didn't want to see me out on the streets, so she bought me a Boston Transit card loaded with $20. She called it her parting gift, enough to get me to whatever cheap motel I was staying at. I looked down at the transit card floating in the dirty water. It was the ultimate insult. After 38 years of marriage, after raising a child, after financing her cosmetic surgeries, her European trips, and her jewelry, my entire worth to her had been reduced to a $20 subway pass. I bent down to pick it up, my knees cracking and reminding me of my age. As I straightened up and wiped the muddy water off the card, a shadow fell over me. It was Julian, my 32-year-old son. He was wearing a custom suit that was comically tight, trying his best to look like the Wall Street tycoons he watched in movies. He was carrying a cardboard box filled with Eleanor's personal items, moving them from the trunk of my car into her new life. I stepped forward, telling him I was glad he was there and suggesting we grab dinner later so I could figure out my next steps. Julian wouldn't even look me in the eye. He stared down at his polished leather shoes, shifting the box uncomfortably and avoiding my gaze. He mumbled that he didn't have time, saying Harrison was taking them to a new Michelin-starred restaurant downtown where a single plate of white truffle pasta cost $400. He said they were celebrating. I asked him if they were celebrating the end of his parents' marriage. When Julian finally looked up, what I saw in his eyes hurt far worse than the divorce papers. It was pity mixed with profound condescension. He told me to be realistic, saying that while I worked hard, the world had changed. He claimed true wealth couldn't be built just by saving a salary. He was excited because Harrison was going to teach him about leverage, green infrastructure investments, and how to operate in private equity. He said Harrison was a highly powerful, wealthy man who could open doors I couldn't even reach the handles of. He told me I should be happy for his mother, saying she finally got the lifestyle upgrade she deserved. An upgrade. My own son was calling another man an upgrade, completely dismissing the father who taught him how to play baseball, stayed up with him through burning fevers, and paid for a college degree he wasn't even using. Looking at Julian, I saw the weakness in his jaw and the hunger for easy money in his eyes. I realized right then that I hadn't just lost a wife. I had lost my son a long time ago, entirely unnoticed because I was too busy working to fund the lifestyle they demanded. A car horn honked loudly. Eleanor yelled from the driver's seat, telling Julian to get in and stop wasting his breath on someone who didn't understand high finance, claiming I thought wealth was just a high-interest savings account. Julian gave me a quick, dismissive nod, told me to take care of myself, avoid doing anything reckless, and maybe take up a hobby like fishing. He turned his back on me, walked over to the Porsche, and got into the passenger seat. He didn't look back once. I watched my vintage sports car roar out of the parking lot, leaving behind a trail of exhaust. I was left standing there completely alone, gripping a dirty transit card in one hand and my small suitcase in the other. Most men would have broken down. Most men would have headed straight to a bar to numb the pain. But I am a chief structural engineer. When a structure becomes completely corroded, you don't mourn it. You isolate the hazard, clear away the compromised walls, and prepare to rebuild the foundation. I walked over to a bus stop bench. The metal was burning hot against my back. I pulled out my phone. My hands were completely steady, and my heart beat with a slow, heavy, ironclad resolve. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for my financial advisor, Thomas Lynch. He answered on the second ring, asking if everything went smoothly at the courthouse. I told him to liquidate everything, my voice completely flat and devoid of emotion. He asked for clarification, wondering if I meant just the blue-chip stocks. I told him everything. The remaining portfolio, the municipal bonds, the antique collection in storage, the land plot in Vermont. Anything that wasn't liquid cash needed to be converted by the end of the day. The line went dead silent before Thomas spoke up, reminding me that this was a massive liquidation. He warned me that the market was volatile and that I might lose a few percentage points in the rush. I told him I didn't care as I watched a smoky city bus pull up to the curb. I instructed him to finalize the liquidation and transfer every cent into the international trust account we had set up the previous month. Surprised, he asked if I was going somewhere. I told him I was, right as the bus doors hissed open, revealing a tired driver who looked thoroughly fed up with his shift. I stepped aboard and tapped the dirty card Eleanor had thrown at me against the scanner. The machine let out a sharp beep, confirming the fare was accepted. I told Thomas I was heading to Bar Harbor, Maine as I walked toward the back of the bus. When he asked when I was leaving, I told him tonight. I hung up and looked out the grimy window. Boston, a city I had physically helped build, was sliding away from me. My ex-wife believed she had stripped me of absolutely everything. My son viewed me as a relic of the past. They thought they had taken my entire life, but they had no idea about my patent for seismic base isolation. They knew nothing about the lucrative technology licensing contract I had signed with a major Japanese conglomerate. By demanding the historic brownstone and the vintage Porsche, they had merely chained themselves to a sinking ship, and I had just severed the lines to sail away. Let them have the car. Let them have the house. I wanted to see exactly how much pressure Harrison's precious leverage could actually take. I closed my eyes, letting the vibration of the bus engine settle my thoughts. This wasn't the conclusion. This was just the first day of an incredibly expensive lesson they were about to learn. 6 months. That's exactly how long it takes to realize that silence isn't empty. It's full of answers. Back in Boston, my life had been a non-stop barrage of endless demands. Eleanor needed a brand new sunroom. Julian needed a financial rescue to cover his failed business venture. And Clara was constantly complaining that our family dinners weren't impressive enough to post online. But here, sitting on the deck of a cabin overlooking the Atlantic Ocean in Bar Harbor, Maine, the only sounds were the distant foghorn of a lighthouse and the cries of seagulls circling the pine trees. I took a sip of my black coffee. Rich, bitter, pure, exactly the way I like it. My neighbors around here think I'm just a retired widower getting by on Social Security checks. They see an old guy in a flannel shirt and broken-in hiking boots, walking down to the pier to buy fresh lobster. They treat me with a level of kindness I haven't felt in decades. "Good morning, Mr. Pendleton," the bakery owner greets me every single day. They have no idea that the man buying a $2 baguette holds the core patents for the most advanced seismic base isolation system in the world. They don't know that every time a new skyscraper tops out in Los Angeles, or a hospital in Tokyo installs earthquake protection, a substantial licensing fee is deposited directly into an account Eleanor never knew existed. She never bothered to ask about my work. To her, I was just blue-collar muscle with dirt under my fingernails. She didn't understand that engineering is a language, and I was one of the few who knew how to write poetry with it. I protected that patent, not out of greed, but out of a survival instinct. It was my safety net, and now it was my freedom. I set my mug down on the coaster, enjoying the warmth of the ceramic. For the first time in years, I could actually breathe. My blood pressure had plummeted. The phantom ache in my back was entirely gone. I was ready to permanently close the book on my old life. Right then, the phone sitting on the wooden table began to vibrate. It was a harsh, mechanical buzz that instantly sliced through the quiet Maine sunshine. I looked at the screen. Flashing across it was the name Julian. My thumb hovered right over the decline button. Since that day in the parking lot, I had spoken to him exactly once. A brief text message letting him know I had arrived safely. He never replied. Why call now? Why disrupt the first real peace I had felt in 40 years? I am a man of logic. Logic dictates that you gather data before making a decision. So, defying my own intuition, I answered. "Hello, Julian," I said. My voice sounded deeper, calmer than he probably remembered. "Dad, is that you?" The signal was clear, but his voice sounded thin, rushed. There was zero warmth in it. No hello, no how are you, not even a belated happy birthday, even though I had turned 69 the previous week. "Yes, Julian, it's me. Is everything all right?" Yeah, everything's great. Incredible, actually," he said. But he was talking too fast. In the background, I could hear clinking glasses and the roar of a crowded room. "We're at the country club in the Hamptons. Harrison just bought a round of Louis the for the entire members' lounge." I didn't say a word. I let the silence stretch, forcing him to fill the void. "Anyway, Dad, I'm calling because Mom wanted me to tell you. It's official. The grand vow renewal and wedding celebration is happening next month." I looked out over the ocean. A small sailboat was cutting its way through the current, fighting the tide. "Next month?" I asked. "The divorce was finalized only 6 months ago. That's a tight schedule." "It's a whirlwind romance, Dad," Julian said, his tone instantly turning defensive. "When you know, you know. Harrison doesn't believe in waiting. He's a mover and a shaker. He's a guy who gets things done." I closed my eyes. Even across hundreds of miles, the comparison stung. Not because I was jealous of Harrison, but because my own son was so easily blinded by the glint of fool's gold. "The venue is a private oceanfront estate in the Hamptons," Julian continued, completely showing off now. 500 guests, caviar flown in directly from Russia. It's going to be the social event of the decade. Mom is going to look like absolute royalty. Sounds expensive, I said dryly. I hope she secured a solid prenuptial agreement. There was a sudden pause on the other end, followed by a rustling sound. The phone was snatched away. "Give me that," a woman's voice hissed. It was Clara, my daughter-in-law, the same woman who once refused to eat a birthday cake I bought because it wasn't from a trendy organic bakery. "Hello, Arthur," she said. Her voice dripped with a dangerous synthetic sweetness. "We just wanted to make sure you got the message. We'll send an invitation out of courtesy, but honestly, you really don't need to come." I tightened my grip on the phone. "Excuse me?" "Let's just be realistic here, Arthur," Clara laughed, a sound that grated hard on my nerves. "Flights from Maine to New York are pricey, especially for someone living on a fixed income. We don't want you stressing over money. And honestly, Harrison has invited governors, senators, CEOs, and people on the Forbes list. It might just be awkward for you. We wouldn't want you feeling out of place in one of your old suits." I looked down at my flannel shirt. It was woven from premium Scottish wool, tailored by hand by an old craftsman in Portland. But to Clara, value only existed in a blatant designer logo, never in actual quality. "So you're calling to rescind the invitation?" I asked, keeping my delivery perfectly level. "We're calling to save you the embarrassment," she corrected, "and to let you know that you've been replaced. When Julian and I renew our vows next year, Harrison is going to walk Julian down the aisle. He's going to be the grandfather to our future children. He's the patriarch of this family now. We just thought you should know, so you don't show up and cause a scene." She didn't wait for my response. I heard her let out another high-pitched, nervous laugh before the line went completely dead. I slowly lowered the phone back onto the table. The sun was still shining. The waves were still crashing against the rocks, but the temperature in my world felt like it had dropped 10 degrees. Replaced, embarrassment, fixed income. I sat there for a long time, analyzing the conversation. I replayed their words in my mind, stripping away the insults to look for the raw data hidden beneath. As an engineer, you learn to understand that noise is often created solely to mask the actual signal. Clara and Julian were making a lot of noise. They were bragging, posturing, and throwing insults. But why? If they were truly that blissfully happy, if Harrison was really this billionaire savior, why bother calling me at all? If I was truly that insignificant, that poor and that irrelevant, why make it a point to tell me to stay away? Why did I still occupy enough real estate in their minds to warrant a deliberate call? I tapped my fingers on the table, 1, 2, 3 times. Fear. That was the signal hidden in the noise. They were afraid. Clara's laugh was too loud. Julian's praise of Harrison was too desperate. They didn't sound like they were trying to convince me. They sounded like they were trying to convince themselves. Suddenly, a realization hit me. A cold, hard fact that made me sit up straight. Harrison, this sudden private equity titan who spent money like water. I thought about the Boston brownstone Eleanor had taken from me. I thought about the joint accounts she had entirely drained. And then I remembered something else. A tiny, seemingly inconsequential detail from our divorce proceedings. 20 years ago, when I personally rewired and structurally reinforced that historic brownstone to bring it up to industrial safety standards, I had attached a structural preservation easement to the property deed. It was a technicality, a legal maneuver to shield our primary asset from potential lawsuits against my engineering firm. I had never revoked that clause. What did that mean? It meant that the property could never be used as collateral for a commercial high-risk loan without my notarized signature. If Harrison was trying to use that house to secure massive leverage, if he was trying to refinance it to pay for this social event of the decade, that clause would trip them up. But they hadn't asked for my signature, which meant only 2 things. Either they didn't know about it yet, or they had forged my name. I looked at my phone again. "You really don't need to come," Clara had said. "We don't want you causing a scene." They weren't afraid of me being poor. They were terrified of me showing up. I stood up. The quiet retirement, the lobsters, the afternoon sun. It would all have to wait. There was a short circuit in the system, and it was threatening the only thing I had left that mattered: my name and my legacy. I couldn't let my foolish son completely ruin his own future. Or perhaps I just needed to see the collapse with my own eyes to believe it. I opened the airline app on my phone. Clara was worried about me affording a ticket. She thought I was pinching pennies. I skipped past economy, bypassed business class, and booked a first-class suite straight to JFK for tomorrow morning. I wasn't going back for a slice of wedding cake. I was going back to inspect the structural integrity of their entire operation, because I had a very strong feeling that the extravagant new life my ex-wife was constructing was actually a ticking time bomb, and when it went off, I wanted to be the one holding the remote control. "One-way ticket," I whispered to the empty deck. I went inside to pack. I selected my finest suit, the deep charcoal one that fit like a suit of armor. They wanted an invisible man. Instead, they were about to hit a brick wall. New York's JFK airport has a highly specific scent. It's a mix of industrial cleaners, jet fuel, and profound anxiety. For 40 years, that smell meant work to me. It meant rushing to fix a blown transformer in a terminal, or diagnosing a baggage carousel that had broken down for the 100th time. But today, arriving from Maine, the air smelled different. It smelled like a calculated confrontation. I walked through the automated doors of the domestic arrivals terminal, no longer the slouched, exhausted man who had left 6 months ago. I was Arthur Pendleton, a man who swam in the North Atlantic every morning and spent his afternoons reading architectural philosophy. My charcoal suit draped perfectly over my shoulders. I had dropped 20 pounds of stress weight. My beard was meticulously trimmed. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like a man who completely owned his time. Pulling my leather carry-on behind me, I headed toward the ground transportation exit when a sudden commotion near the VIP pickup area caught my attention. Normally, I would ignore it. Noise is just a sign of system inefficiency. But then I heard a voice far more familiar than my own heartbeat. A voice that used to whisper goodnight to me, but lately had only known how to scream. "Eleanor." I stepped behind a thick concrete pillar, partially concealed by a group of tourists, arguing over a map. I nudged my sunglasses up the bridge of my nose. I needed a clear view of the structural defects before making my presence known. There she was, my ex-wife. She was standing by the curb, flanked by 3 pristine, brand-new Louis Vuitton suitcases. Even though it was only early October, she was wearing an absurdly theatrical white fur coat. She looked frantic, constantly checking her makeup in a small, compact mirror, smoothing down her hair and adjusting the diamond studs in her ears. She was a walking textbook definition of a woman desperately trying to broadcast a status she hadn't earned. Then the motorcade arrived. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was a cheap production. 3 black Cadillac Escalades flanked a gleaming silver Maybach S-Class. The convoy screeched to a halt with an aggressive, completely unnecessary level of drama for an airport arrival. A uniformed driver sprang out, throwing open the passenger door of the Maybach, and Harrison stepped into the light. He looked exactly like his social media profiles, heavily tanned, teeth blindingly white, and a suit that cost more than the down payment on my first home. He spread his arms wide, performing for a crowd that didn't exist. "My queen," he boomed, his voice bouncing off the concrete overhang. "New York isn't the same without its brightest star." Eleanor let out a high-pitched shriek, throwing herself into his arms. I watched them embrace. The whole thing looked completely rehearsed, like a scene from a low-budget soap opera canceled for terrible acting. Julian was right there too, climbing out of one of the Escalades, high-fiving the drivers and strutting around as if he were part of a presidential security detail. Most people walking past stopped to stare, whispering to each other, wondering if he was a movie star or some famous billionaire. I stared too, but I wasn't looking at the fur coat or the bleached teeth. I was looking at the vehicle, specifically the rear bumper of that silver Maybach. To the untrained eye, it was a rolling monument to infinite wealth. But I am an engineer with 40 years of forensic inspection under my belt. My gaze locked onto the license plate frame. It was a low-profile black chrome finish, but I spotted the etched logo in the bottom corner alongside a discreet New York TLC commercial stamp. Empire Luxury Transport. A cold smile touched my lips. Empire Luxury Transport wasn't an elite dealership. It was a high-end vehicle rental agency based out of Queens. I knew their operation intimately because years ago, my firm was hired to reinforce the structural foundation of their main garage when it started settling. I knew their fleet, I knew their daily rates, and I knew exactly who rented from them. Mostly influencers and aspiring artists who needed to lease an image of wealth for a 24-hour music video shoot. Real private equity tycoons don't lease vehicles with rental agency frames. True billionaires employ full-time staff and run private plates. Harrison Vance, the visionary pioneer of the green economy, was picking up his bride in a $2,000 a day rental. As I watched the driver load Eleanor's designer luggage, I noticed the trunk lid failed to catch automatically. The driver had to physically force it down to get it to lock. A clear mechanical defect in the hydraulic latch that the rental company hadn't bothered to service yet. Harrison wasn't buying the world. He was leasing it by the hour. The moment they accelerated away, leaving a plume of exhaust behind, I finally moved. I walked over to the taxi line, my mind calculating the variables. Renting a luxury car isn't a crime. Maybe his personal vehicle was in the shop. Maybe he liked variety. But when you added that rental frame to Julian's desperate, frantic phone call warning me away, it tripped a massive red flag in the system. "Driver," I said, slipping into the back of a yellow cab, "take me to the First National Bank on Broad Street. Run the meter, cover the long-distance fees, and I'll make sure you're taken care of." I didn't check into a hotel. I didn't stop for food. I went straight to the source of the capital. The First National Bank was a cathedral of marble and polished brass. I had held accounts there for 30 years. It was where I deposited my very first paycheck as an intern, and where I signed the original mortgage for the Back Bay brownstone Eleanor now called her own. I walked inside, the crisp air conditioning hitting my face. Old Mike, the security guard, looked up from his desk. His eyes widened when he recognized me. "Mr. Pendleton, is that you? Man, you look like you've taken 10 years off your life." "Travel agrees with me, Mike," I said, shaking his hand firmly. "Is Thomas in?" "Mr. Lynch? Yeah, he's back in his office. Head on through. He was actually asking about you recently." I knocked on the heavy oak door of the branch manager's office. Thomas Lynch, a friend since our days on the university rowing team, looked up from his monitor and immediately dropped his pen. "Arthur!" he exclaimed, stepping out from behind his desk to embrace me. "I thought you'd permanently relocated to the wilderness. You look like $1,000,000. I took a seat in the leather armchair across from him, skipping the small talk. "Thomas, I need to look at my historical files, and I need to ask you about the Back Bay property." Thomas's smile instantly faded. He sat back down, his expression shifting from friendly to professional, then hardening into an expression that looked a lot like deep concern. He tapped a few keys on his board. "I take it this is regarding the recent transaction?" Thomas asked quietly. "What transaction?" I countered. "The divorce decree awarded the house to Eleanor. My name was stripped from the title. I signed the quitclaim deed myself." "Yes," Thomas said, turning the monitor so I could see the internal file. "Your name was removed from the title. But because your name remains hard-coded into the original structural preservation easement history, I receive an automated notification for any material changes. Arthur, 2 weeks ago, Eleanor refinanced that house." I leaned forward. "Refinanced? In theory, she should hold clear equity. I paid that mortgage off 5 years ago." "She took out a hard money bridge loan," Thomas said, pointing to a figure on the screen. "A massive one. She leveraged 80% of the home's appraised value. Arthur, that's $1.5 million in liquid cash drawn out." A heavy silence settled into the room, making the hum of the office servers sound deafening. $1.5 million? That house was the safety net I built for her. It was the roof over her head. "Why?" I asked. "Why does she need that kind of liquidity? She took 60% of my investment portfolio plus alimony." Thomas hesitated, glancing at the door to ensure it was completely latched. "She came in with him, Arthur. This guy Vance did all the talking. He told the loan officer, who was completely starstruck, by the way, that he needed short-term bridge capital to lock down an investment in a massive eco-resort development. He threw around every trendy buzzword in the book: carbon neutral, ESG integration, offshore tax structures. He told Eleanor he was letting her in on the ground floor because he loved her, promising to triple her investment within 90 days. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. It wasn't anger. It was the sickening realization of watching a structure collapse in slow motion because someone had intentionally cut a load-bearing column. "He's a private equity tycoon, Thomas," I said, my voice dripping with irony. "Why does a private equity tycoon need to extract cash from his fiancée's primary residence for bridge capital?" "Exactly," Thomas muttered. "We ran a soft background check as standard procedure. Arthur, the guy is a ghost. He has credit cards, sure. He has an LLC registered in Delaware, but he has no footprint with any major banking institution in the Northeast. His wealth appears entirely liquid and constantly in transit." But Eleanor signed the paperwork without hesitation. She looked at him like he was a savior. She wired the funds to his LLC account that very afternoon. I leaned back, staring up at the ceiling tiles. The rented Maybach. Julian's frantic phone call telling me to stay away. $1.5 million extracted from the house like marrow from a bone. This wasn't just a bad rebound marriage. It was a harvest. Harrison Vance wasn't marrying my ex-wife. He was systematically liquidating her assets. And Julian, my arrogant, naive son, was likely next on the menu. "Does Julian know about this?" I asked. Thomas shook his head. Julian signed as a witness to the transaction. He was openly boasting about the Lamborghini he planned to buy with his cut of the returns. I stood up. My hands were shaking, not out of fear, but from the sheer, staggering magnitude of the ignorance unfolding right in front of me. They had called me a failure. They had told me I thought too small. And the entire time, they were handing the keys to the kingdom to a man who didn't even own his own vehicle. "Thank you, Thomas," I said, fastening the buttons of my suit jacket. "Arthur, what are you going to do?" Thomas asked, rising from his chair. "This is all legal. She signed the paperwork willingly. You can't stop this." I walked to the office door and paused, looking back. The old Arthur would have rushed to her new place, begged her to stop, and yelled until she finally listened. The old Arthur would have tried to save her from herself. But the old Arthur was gone. He died in that parking lot the day she slammed that transit card against his chest. "I'm not planning to stop it, Thomas," I said, my voice ice-cold and steady. "I'm just going to ensure that when the lights finally go out, I'm the only person in the room holding a flashlight." I walked out of the bank and into the biting Boston autumn air. The wind cut right through my suit, but I didn't feel it. I had a grand celebration to attend, and I needed to make sure I had a front-row seat when the final bill arrived. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from Clara. "Just a reminder, the rehearsal dinner is strictly for core members of the wedding party. Don't embarrass us by showing up uninvited." I stared at the message and typed out a brief reply. "Understood. I will be nothing more than a bystander." I hit send. A bystander? Yes, that was exactly the role I was going to play. A spectator to a complete public dismantling. But first, I had one more stop to make. I needed to go somewhere Harrison Vance would never expect me to show up. I was going to attend their exclusive family appreciation luncheon at the Top Country Club in the Hamptons. If they were playing Russian roulette with money they didn't have, I was ready to play chess with the truth. And the truth, as I had learned over 68 years of life, is the only asset that never depreciates. The Oakmont Country Club was the kind of place where the lighting was intentionally dimmed, the menus had no prices, and the waiters looked down their noses at you if you asked about the daily specials. It was a cathedral of excessive Hamptons consumption, a place where people went not to eat, but to be seen eating. I walked in exactly 5 minutes late. I had spent the entire morning verifying the precise geographical coordinates of Harrison's supposed Costa Rican eco-resort. Now I was entirely prepared to look at the people who were currently burning through the capital, extracted from my life's work. "Sir, do you have a reservation?" The maitre d' stopped me, a young man with slicked-back hair who had clearly practiced his snobbish smirk in the mirror. His eyes flicked over my suit, desperately searching for a reason to bar me from entry. "I am with the Vance party," I said, my voice carrying a quiet authority. His expression shifted instantly. "Ah, Mr. Vance's private alcove. Right this way, sir. He led me through the main dining room, past tables of local politicians and hedge fund managers, toward a semi-private booth in the back. They were already seated. Eleanor looked like a disco ball, wearing a sequined dress that was far too youthful for her. Julian was nervously sipping a glass of whiskey, while Clara stared at her phone, completely ignoring everyone. And then there was Harrison. Harrison sat at the head of the table, his arms spread wide across the back of the leather booth, asserting his territory like a silverback gorilla. When he spotted me, his smile never reached his eyes. It was the grin of a predator. "Arthur!" he boomed, half rising from his seat, but making no actual effort to offer his hand. "We didn't think you'd actually show up. We figured a flight down from rural Maine might be a bit too taxing on your system." I pulled out the empty chair directly across from him. "My system is perfectly fine, Harrison. I've survived decades of brutal Boston winters, supervising bridge construction sites. A first-class flight is hardly a challenge." Clara looked up from her screen, her eyes scanning my charcoal suit, the one crafted by the old-school tailor in Portland who dressed local statesmen. "Arthur, are you planning to wear that to the actual ceremony?" she asked, her voice loud enough to make neighboring tables turn. "It looks a bit boxy. Did you pick that up at a discount outlet? We really want this to be a strict black tie affair. We don't want you looking like part of the catering staff." I smoothed down the lapel of my jacket. The fabric was a Super 150S wool, soft as butter. It cost more than her first car. "It's bespoke," I said softly. "Real legacy families value the quality of the tailoring over a loud designer logo." She rolled her eyes. "Legacy families, please. You probably bought that at a tourist trap. Harrison wears Tom Ford. That's what actual success looks like." Eleanor placed a manicured hand on Harrison's arm, marking her territory. "Don't be cruel, Clara. Arthur is doing the best he can. He's always been incredibly frugal." Harrison let out a low chuckle. "Let's get the man a drink. Waiter!" A sommelier appeared instantly, holding a leather-bound wine list. "Bring us a bottle of the 1996 Chateau Mouton Rothschild," Harrison ordered without even glancing at the selections. "And bring my friend here a tasting glass." He pointed a thick finger at me. "Arthur, I want you to experience this. You probably stick to cheap boxed varieties or domestic beer. Consider this an education for your palate. That's a $2,000 bottle of wine. Try not to gulp it down." Silence fell over the table. Julian stared intently at his plate. He knew I didn't drink cheap boxed wine. He knew that years ago I had built a climate-controlled cellar in our basement, which Eleanor later converted into a storage closet for her shoes. The sommelier poured a small amount of deep red liquid into a glass and placed it in front of me. Harrison watched with an expectant grin, waiting for me to be awestruck, waiting for me to express gratitude for his charity. I picked up the glass, swirled it gently, and held it up to the light. The color was slightly off. The edges were entirely too brown for a '96 vintage. I brought it to my nose. It was completely corked. The wine was ruined, smelling strongly of wet cardboard and cheap vinegar. I looked across at Harrison. He was flushed with pride, waiting for my praise. "Well?" he asked. "Can you taste the oak? Can you perceive the history in that glass?" I set the stemware back down. "It is certainly unique," I said diplomatically. "It has an incredibly sharp, pungent quality to it. I think it suits you perfectly, Harrison." The insult flew right over his head. He laughed loudly and clapped his hands together. "Pour for everyone! We are celebrating!" "Celebrating what?" I asked. Harrison leaned forward, resting his elbows firmly on the table. "The future, Arthur. My future. Our future. I just finalized a seed funding round for my eco-infrastructure startup. We are utilizing blockchain technology to completely revolutionize how people acquire vacation real estate. Julian here is stepping in as my vice president of operations." I looked over at my son. "Julian, you're resigning from your position at the real estate appraisal firm. That was a stable career with full benefits." Julian finally met my gaze, his eyes full of defiance, even though his hands were visibly trembling. "Dad, stop living in the past. A salary is for people who are afraid to take risks. Harrison is giving me equity and stock options. When the company goes public in 2 years, my net worth will hit 8 figures. And what is your salary until then? I asked. Julian hesitated. To maximize our growth, we are taking a nominal base pay. But Harrison covers my expenses. He's looking out for us. I turned my attention to Eleanor. She was nodding along eagerly. He's incredibly generous, Arthur. He just paid off the remainder of Julian's student loans last week. Did you physically see the receipt? I asked her. Or did he simply inform you that it was taken care of? Arthur, Eleanor snapped. Why must you always be so relentlessly negative? Why can't you just be happy that our son has finally found a father figure who actually understands how to win? The words hung in the air like a thick smoke. A father figure. Julian cleared his throat, reaching into his jacket pocket to pull out a small velvet box. He didn't open it. He just gripped it tightly in his palm. Actually, Dad, there's something I need to tell you about the ceremony, Julian said. Go ahead, son, Harrison encouraged, leaning back and taking a large gulp of the ruined wine. A brief grimace crossed his face, but he swallowed it down, far too proud to admit he had ordered a bottle of vinegar. Julian took a deep breath. Dad, about the wedding logistics. We discussed it. Typically, the groom's biological father stands right beside him at the altar. But what? I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. But Harrison is the one making this entire celebration possible, Julian blurted out. He paid for the venue. He funded the honeymoon. In just 6 months, he's been more of a father to me than you were in 30 years. You taught me how to pinch pennies. He's teaching me how to generate millions. Julian looked to Harrison for approval before continuing. So, I've asked Harrison to serve as my best man and to take the traditional father's place in the ceremony. He'll be giving the primary toast, and he'll be signing the registry. And where exactly does that leave me? I asked. Clara chimed in with a cruel smile. You're a guest, Arthur. We reserved a seat for you at a table in the back, right next to great Aunt Martha. You know, the one who's hard of hearing. We didn't want you to feel the pressure of having to deliver a speech. We know public speaking isn't your strength. I looked at the 4 of them sitting there. My ex-wife had traded our entire history for a rented Maybach. My daughter-in-law measured a person's worth by social media validation. My son was trading his dignity for options in a company that existed only on paper. And Harrison, the conductor of this entire train wreck, was drinking spoiled wine and convincing himself it was nectar. I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It wasn't pain, it was absolute, undeniable relief. The final cable holding me to these people had just snapped. I was completely free. I slowly stood up and buttoned my suit jacket. I understand, I said. Harrison laughed out loud. Don't take it personally, old man. It's just business. Evolution. Survival of the fittest. I picked up my water glass. To the groom, I said, locking eyes with Julian. May your equity be as real as your loyalty. I turned my gaze to Harrison. And to the new patriarch. I hope your wallet is as thick as your stories, Harrison, because carrying the weight of this family is a lot heavier than it looks. Harrison's grin stiffened for a fraction of a second. What's that supposed to mean? It means enjoy your lunch, I said. I have an early flight to catch. Or at least that's what I'm telling myself. I turned and walked away. I didn't look back, but I could feel their eyes on me. I heard Clara whisper, God, he is so bitter. I walked past the open kitchen, past the wine cellar, and stopped by the host stand near the front entrance. I waited. I wasn't leaving just yet. Pretending to check my coat, I lingered in the shadows of the foyer. Through the glass partition, I watched the waiter head toward their table with the bill inside a black leather folder. Harrison snatched it with a theatrical flourish, not even glancing at the total. He pulled out a black metal credit card and flicked it onto the tray like a dart. I counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. The waiter walked over to the terminal at the side station and swiped the card. He frowned. He rubbed the magnetic strip against his apron and tried again. He tapped the screen, paused, and walked back to the table. Leaning down, he whispered something directly into Harrison's ear. Harrison laughed entirely too loudly, waving his hand dismissively. Mouth movements alone told the story. Try it again. The waiter went back, swiped the card a 3rd time, and then picked up the phone next to the register. After a brief conversation, he hung up and returned to the table, this time without the leather folder. I saw Harrison's face change instantly. A deep flush started at his neck and traveled all the way up to his hairline. He patted his pockets frantically, pulled out a blue card and handed it over. The waiter went back to the terminal. Swipe, pause, a shake of the head. I watched Eleanor reach for her purse, pulling out her own card, but Harrison stopped her, grabbing her wrist firmly. He was openly arguing with the waiter now. His gestures grew wilder as he pointed to his suit, then to the table, clearly projecting a desperate, "Do you know who I am?" vibe. The manager began walking over. That was all the data I needed. The first crack in the dam. The water was already leaking through. I pushed open the heavy front door and stepped out into the crisp, cool air. It tasted sweet. "Hey, Chief," the valet called out. "Need me to bring your car around?" "No," I replied, hailing a passing taxi. "I don't have a car. I have a transit card, and right now it's the most valuable thing in the world, because it actually has money on it." As the cab pulled away, I glanced back at the restaurant window. Harrison was standing there, red-faced and furious, while Julian frantically searched his empty pockets. That lunch was a minor setback for them. But the real bill, the ultimate day of reckoning, was coming tomorrow, and the interest was going to be devastating. That evening, a pre-wedding cocktail party was held at a lavish penthouse Harrison had leased. The entire event was designed to pitch his Costa Rican eco-resort scheme to the elite of Boston and New York. I stood in the shadows of the balcony, holding a glass of club soda, looking down at the city lights. This was the city where I had personally verified the structural integrity of buildings, brick by brick. Now I felt like a ghost observing a stage play. Harrison was delivering a speech in the middle of the living room, surrounded by a crowd of hungry-looking men. They weren't hungry for food. They were desperate for the kind of fast, effortless money that destroys lives. Julian stood right beside him, practically vibrating with excitement. My son looked like a child finally invited to sit at the adults' table, completely oblivious to the fact that he was actually on the menu. "Gentlemen," Harrison's voice boomed through the open French doors, dripping with absolute confidence. "Traditional real estate investments are as dead as dinosaurs. They're too slow, choked out by regulators who only want to keep you down. What I'm offering you tonight isn't just an investment, it's an exit strategy from the Matrix." He pulled out his phone, lighting up the screen to cast onto a massive television on the wall. Charts appeared, showing a jagged green line shooting straight into the stratosphere. "We hold exclusive development rights to 600 prime oceanfront acres on the Gold Coast of Costa Rica. The government has already fast-tracked our green construction permits. We are talking a 300% return in the first quarter alone, and that is a conservative estimate." I looked closely at Julian's face. He was staring at the screen with an expression of pure awe and greed. He wasn't asking for geological survey reports, and he wasn't checking for building permit verifications. He just saw imaginary zeros multiplying in his bank account. "I'm in," one of the guests announced, a man I recognized as the owner of a local car dealership chain. "Put me down for 50 grand. 50? Harrison chuckled, a dismissive, patronizing sound. "That's a fine starting position, Mike, but the threshold for true founder's equity sits at 200,000. "I'm in for 200, Julian blurted out. My heart skipped a beat. $200,000. That was the absolute limit of his liquid capital. Harrison placed a heavy hand on Julian's shoulder, giving it a firm squeeze. "That's my boy. That's what vision looks like. You see, gentlemen, this young man understands the future. He isn't afraid to pull the trigger. I wanted to march right into that room. I wanted to grab Julian by the collar and shake him until he woke up. I wanted to yell that Costa Rican land deeds are public record, and if Harrison actually owned them, he wouldn't be pitching to car dealers in a leased penthouse. He'd be on Wall Street. I had looked up those coordinates on my phone just minutes earlier. It was a federally protected mangrove swamp with an incredibly high soil liquefaction rate. Building any kind of foundation there would require $1 billion in deep steel pipe pilings just to secure the ground. But I knew Julian wouldn't listen. He was intoxicated by the illusion of proximity to power. Intervening now would only make me the villain in their success story. Just then, Eleanor emerged from the bedroom. If Harrison was the king of this illusion, Eleanor was his queen. She wore a silver custom evening gown, But the real reflection wasn't coming from the dress. It was coming from the necklace around her neck. It was a cascading waterfall of diamonds, wrapping tightly around her throat and trailing down her chest. It was massive, loud, and incredibly ostentatious. It had to be at least 50 carats. Harrison left the circle of men, walked over to her, and took her hand, kissing it gently. "And here is the inspiration for it all," he announced to the room. "My beautiful fiancée, wearing a rare heirloom from the Vance family vault. These stones have been passed down through generations." The room gasped in admiration. Clara rushed over, taking frantic photos with her phone, the flash blindingly bright. "Oh my God, Mom, you look like royalty. Those diamonds are insane." Eleanor touched the stones at her throat, a proud flush on her face. She looked out toward the balcony, spotting me in the shadows. She lifted her chin in a gesture of pure, unadulterated defiance. "Look at what I have," her eyes were saying. "Look at what you could never give me." I stepped forward into the light, my engineering instincts completely taking over. I have a habit, an obsession, really, with understanding the internal mechanics of materials. Years ago, for our 30th anniversary, I saved for 3 years to buy Eleanor a sapphire pendant. It wasn't large, but it was flawless. I spent weeks with gemologists, learning about clarity, cuts, and refractive index. I learned how light bends when it enters high-density stones. I knew that real diamonds handle light with incredible dignity. They flash with a crisp gray-white and subtle hints of orange or blue fire. I narrowed my eyes, focusing entirely on the necklace, as Eleanor moved beneath the chandelier. The stones were flashing, but they were flashing entirely too much. They cast off a chaotic explosion of reds, greens, and purples, resembling a cheap disco ball. In physics, this is known as double refraction. True diamonds are singly refractive. They never break down light in that manner. Moissanite does. Cubic zirconia does. High lead glass does. What's more, that supposedly vintage heirloom concluded with a modern, mass-produced industrial lobster clasp. I felt a cold smile touch my lips. A historic family heirloom? It was a complete fabrication, a physically verifiable material lie hanging right from my ex-wife's neck. If the diamonds were fake, then the eco-resort was fake. The investment portfolio was fake. The entire man was an illusion. I looked at Harrison. He was basking in the admiration, his arm wrapped around Eleanor's waist. He looked completely untouchable, but I spotted the beads of sweat on his upper lip. I saw how his eyes kept darting around the room, constantly scanning, constantly checking the exits. He wasn't a billionaire relaxing in his penthouse. He was a fugitive hiding in plain sight. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, keeping it level with my chest, as if checking a text. "Hey, Harrison," I called out, my voice cutting cleanly through the chatter. He looked over, visibly annoyed by the interruption. "What is it, Arthur?" "I just wanted to say," I began, stepping fully into the light, "that is some incredibly elaborate craftsmanship. It reminds me exactly of the pieces they sell on the street corners down on Fifth Avenue." Harrison froze entirely. His smile vanished. For a split second, the mask slipped completely away. He knew that I knew. He saw the precise, calculated measurement in my eyes. "Thank you, Arthur," he said stiffly, his voice tight. "Now, if you'll excuse us." He turned Eleanor around, shielding her from my gaze, desperately trying to hide the defect from the only man in the room who understood material science and refractive indexes. But it was already too late. I had already captured the data on my phone. I looked down at the screen. The image was sharp, capturing Harrison's features flawlessly under the crystalline chandelier light. I pulled up my encrypted messaging app, scrolling down until I found a contact saved simply as David. David was a close friend from my university days, now serving as a senior forensic accountant for the Securities and Exchange Commission. He specialized in tracking white-collar financial crimes and Ponzi schemes, and he commanded databases that would make the FBI envious. I attached the photograph and typed out a brief message. "David, do me a favor. Run facial recognition on this guy. Goes by Harrison Vance. Claims to be a private equity tycoon. I suspect he's wearing glass around his neck and selling smoke out of his mouth. Tell me what you find. I tapped send. The small loading icon spun for a brief moment before turning into a checkmark. Dispatched. I raised my head to see Julian shaking Harrison's hand, finalizing that $200,000 investment. Eleanor was smiling, fingering her absurdly fake diamonds, completely oblivious to the fact that she was prominently displaying the badge of her own imminent financial ruin. I finished the remainder of my club soda. The taste was flat. I had fulfilled my portion of the task. I had gathered the data, and now I simply needed to wait for the laboratory results. As I moved toward the elevators to make an early exit, Clara blocked my path. She held a glass of champagne, a sneer plastered across her face. "Leaving so soon, Arthur?" she asked. "It must be incredibly difficult to witness what a true provider looks like." I looked at her, then at the rented penthouse that didn't belong to them, at the synthetic jewels, and at the son who had traded his dignity for an illusion. "It has been highly educational, Clara," I said evenly. "I learned a great deal tonight." "About what? Being a loser?" "No," I replied, stepping around her. "About how expensive this tuition is going to be." I walked out of the building, leaving the celebration continuing behind me, a fragile bubble of deception floating on pure vanity. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a reply from David. "Give me 24 hours. If this is who I think it is, you'll want to stay well clear of the blast radius." I pulled my jacket tight against the chill. I had no intention of clearing out. I planned to stand exactly at the epicenter of the detonation, because when this structure collapses, I must ensure the debris doesn't bury the only thing I have left to salvage: my own name. The countdown had officially begun. At 11 o'clock that night, the pounding began. It wasn't a polite knock. It was a rhythmic, impatient thrashing that vibrated through the heavy core of my hotel room door. I was sitting in the armchair near the window, analyzing a structural report on the fatigue limits of seismic materials. Anything to keep my mind off the image of my ex-wife wearing a necklace made of lead glass. Before the door even swung open, I knew exactly who was on the other side. Desperation possesses a very specific cadence, and my son Julian had been broadcasting it for days. I opened the door. Julian stood in the hallway, bathed in the yellow glare of the fluorescent lights. He looked thoroughly unraveled. His tie was loosened, hanging askew like an undone noose. His eyes were bloodshot, and despite the crisp air conditioning of the corridor, a thin sheen of nervous sweat coated his forehead. He offered no greeting. He didn't ask if I was busy. He simply pushed past me into the room, bringing with him the distinct scent of stale whiskey and expensive cologne. I closed the door quietly, watching him pace back and forth in the small carpeted clearing between the bed and the desk. He was vibrating with erratic energy, his hands repeatedly opening and clenching into fists. "Would you like some water, Julian?" I asked, keeping my tone measured. "You look dehydrated." "I don't need your water, Dad," he snapped, turning on his heel to face me. "I need you to listen to reason. For once in your life, I need you to stop being a roadblock and start being a team player." I walked to the minibar anyway and poured a glass of water, setting it on the desk. "I'm always reasonable," I said. "That's why I'm an engineer. Rationality keeps structures from collapsing. What exactly is the emergency, son?" Julian reached into the internal pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a document folded into thirds, heavily creased from rough handling. He smoothed it out onto the desk with jerky, uncoordinated movements. "It's the trust," he said. "The 529 educational fund you set up for the grandkids." I looked down at the paperwork. It was the deed for the Pendleton Family Educational Trust. It wasn't a fortune, just $150,000 I had painstakingly scraped together over 20 years. Every time I worked a holiday shift, every time I pulled double duty in a freezing basement, I deposited $100 into that account. It was designed to ensure that if Julian ever had children, they wouldn't have to build their foundation from absolute zero. "What about it?" I asked. "It's sitting securely in a conservative index fund. It's safe." "That is exactly the problem," Julian shouted, throwing his hands in the air. "It's safe. It's stagnant. It's yielding barely 3% a year, Dad. 3%. Inflation is eating that capital alive." "Let me guess," I said, leaning back against the wall. "Harrison has a superior strategy." Julian's eyes illuminated with that same fanatical glow I had witnessed at the cocktail party. Yes, Harrison reviewed the portfolio. He laughed, Dad. He literally laughed out loud. He said it's mattress money. He wants to move it into his liquidity pool. He guarantees 15% returns monthly. He's willing to manage it for us entirely free of charge because he cares about our family legacy. I felt a sharp ache in my chest. It wasn't a physical ailment. It was the heartbreaking realization that my son was no longer just a victim. He was a willing accomplice in his own destruction. He was prepared to take the only pure thing I had constructed, a safety net for unborn children, and throw it directly into a wolf's jaw. "So you're here to have me sign away my trustee rights?" I asked. "I'm here to have you sign the release form," Julian corrected. "Harrison needs full authorization to transfer the principal tonight. The Asian markets open in 3 hours, and he wants to deploy the capital before the opening bell." "And if I refuse?" I asked. Julian stopped pacing. He looked at me, and for the first time in his life, I saw something truly hollow in his face. It was the expression of a man who had burned every retreat option and had no choice left but to plunge into the fire. "Don't make this difficult, Dad," he threatened, his voice dropping to a low hiss. "Harrison has lawyers, powerful lawyers. If you persist in holding this money hostage while letting it stagnate, that constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty. We can sue you. We can have the courts declare you incompetent to manage the estate. Harrison says he can arrange a competency hearing by Monday. Do you really want to spend your retirement fighting a legal battle you can't afford?" I stared at him. My own son was threatening to declare me senile. He was threatening to drag my reputation through the mud, all to hand over $150,000 to a con man. I realized right then that the boy I raised was entirely gone. The boy who cried when he scraped his knee, the boy who used to carry my toolbox, had been entirely consumed. Standing before me was a hollow shell filled with another man's fabrications. "You would do that?" I asked softly. "You would sue your own biological father?" Julian flinched for a fraction of a second, but then greed reasserted its dominance. "I'm doing what is best for this family," he said, reciting the script. "I'm maximizing our assets. Just sign the paperwork, Dad. Stop being a dinosaur." I walked over to the desk and looked down at the document. It was a standard transfer of trustee authority. It granted Julian immediate, unrestricted access to the principal. If I signed it as it was, the money would be gone tomorrow morning. Harrison would drain it to pay for his rental cars and champagne, leaving my future descendants with nothing. But if I refused, Julian would cause an uproar. He would drag the process out with endless threats and screaming matches, and frankly, I was exhausted. I was thoroughly tired of fighting a war against people who were determined to surrender. But I am a structural engineer. When faced with an unstoppable torrent of water, you don't block it with your body. You build a diversion channel. "Fine," I said. I picked up a pen from the desk. Julian let out a massive sigh of relief, a breath he had been holding the entire time. "Thank you. You're finally making the right choice." I pressed the nib of the pen to the paper, but I didn't sign the bottom. Not yet. "I'm going to add a minor rider," I said casually. "Just a small notation for my own records to prove I acted in good faith." "Whatever," Julian said, checking his watch. "Just make it quick." I found the clause regarding fund disbursement. In clear, precise print, I crossed out immediate right of access and wrote in the margin, "Funds are to be restricted to a third-party escrow account until the designated beneficiaries reach the age of 18. Transfer of management authorized strictly under this condition." It was a restrictive covenant. It meant that even if Julian became the trustee, he couldn't touch the principal. He could transfer it to Harrison's fund if he wished, but the bank would never release the cash. The money would remain locked away until an unborn child reached adulthood. I signed my name with a swift, clean flourish at the bottom. "There," I said, "it's all yours." Before the ink could even dry, Julian snatched the document from beneath my fingers. He didn't read it. He didn't even glance at the modified text. He saw only the signature at the bottom. That was all that mattered to him. Victory. "About time," he muttered, folding the paper and shoving it back into his pocket. "Harrison is going to be incredibly pleased. This demonstrates our commitment. He turned toward the door, offering no thank you, no goodbye. He had extracted what he came for. "Julian," I called out. He stopped, his hand resting on the brass doorknob. "What?" "I hope you read the fine print on all those files Harrison handed you," I said, "because the devil is always in the details." He let out a sharp scoff. "Harrison doesn't need fine print. He does business on a handshake. That's how actual deals get made." He threw open the door and marched out, slamming it hard behind him. I stood completely alone in the absolute silence of the hotel room. Moving over to the window, I looked down at the street below. I watched my foolish son rush out of the lobby entrance, jump into a waiting taxi, and vanish into the night. He was in an immense hurry to hand a locked chest to a thief who didn't even possess a key. I felt a profound sorrow, but absolutely no regret. I had preserved the capital, I had protected the future, but I had lost the present. My son was gone, pressing his foot hard on the accelerator toward a cliff, completely convinced he was learning how to fly. I walked back to the armchair and picked up my paperwork. The dossier from David had officially arrived. I flipped to the next page. Attached was a copy of an arrest record from a Florida police department dated 3 years prior. The mugshot was slightly blurred, but the face was unmistakable. That wasn't Harrison Vance. That was Howard Fisk, arrested for selling completely fraudulent timeshare properties to retirees. I checked the date of the ceremony. It was exactly 2 days away. I took a slow sip of the water I had poured for Julian. It was crisp, cool, and clean. "Get some sleep, son," I whispered to the empty room. "You're going to need the rest, because when you wake up, the nightmare is going to become very, very real." The oceanfront Hamptons estate had been converted into an incredibly lavish botanical garden. It was an exhibition of near-vulgar excess. Thousands of white orchids, likely flown in from Thailand that very morning, cascaded from the ceilings like waterfalls. The scent was so thick it felt like walking directly into a perfume manufacturing plant. A 20-piece symphony orchestra sat on an elevated platform playing Mozart, their precise execution costing an estimated $500 an hour per musician. Everything in the room screamed wealth. Everything was meticulously engineered to say, "Look at us. Look at how much we possess. Look at how high we have climbed." But I am an engineer. I don't look at the decorations. I inspect the structure. I looked at the floor layout and noted that the massive floral arrangements were entirely blocking the emergency fire exits. I looked at the lighting rigs and saw heavy power cables carelessly taped down across the main thoroughfare. A massive slip-and-fall liability just waiting for a lawsuit. I looked at these people, my former family, and all I saw was a foundation that had already begun crumbling to dust. I stood at the entrance holding my invitation. A young usher with a clipboard glanced at my name, looked up at me, and then lowered his eyes back to his list. He hesitated, his face flushing a deep red out of sheer second-hand embarrassment for me. "Mr. Pendleton," he murmured, avoiding my gaze. Right this way, sir." He didn't lead me to the front rows where the immediate family usually gathered. He didn't lead me to the middle section where friends and business associates were mingling. He escorted me past the ice sculptures, past the chocolate fountains, and past the rows of velvet chairs reserved for the high-profile individuals Harrison was trying to impress. We kept walking until we reached the absolute back wall of the venue. "Here we are, sir," the usher mumbled, quickly stepping away. "Table T42. It was the very last table in the entire hall. It sat directly adjacent to the double-swinging kitchen doors, where servers rushed in and out with heavy trays of food, creating a constant barrage of clattering silverware and shouting. To my left was the entrance to the restrooms. Every time the door swung open, the scent of industrial air freshener and commercial plumbing drifted directly across our table setting. I took my seat. My companions at this table were a collection of ghosts from the past. There was 90-year-old great-aunt Martha, who genuinely believed she was sitting in a bingo hall. There was a distant cousin of Eleanor's whom I hadn't seen in 15 years, already thoroughly intoxicated, and there were 3 empty chairs. Even the uninvited guests seemed to reject sitting back here. This was it. This was my calculated position in their brave new world. I wasn't just an ex-husband, I was discarded material. I was an inconvenience to be hidden safely away near the restrooms and the trash bins. I rested my hand on the tablecloth. It was premium silk. In my head, I quickly calculated the cost of the event. The flowers, the venue rental, the orchestra, the catering. The bill easily exceeded $300,000. Half of the capital Eleanor had extracted from the Back Bay brownstone was already entirely gone, burned away in a 6-hour party to celebrate a complete illusion. I poured myself a glass of water from the pitcher. I didn't touch the wine. I needed to keep my mind perfectly sharp. Suddenly my chair vibrated violently. I looked up to find Clara standing over me, wearing an incredibly expensive bridesmaid gown with a plunging neckline. Her makeup was heavily applied, but it did nothing to mask the malice in her expression. She had deliberately kicked the leg of my chair with her stiletto. "Oh, oops," she said, her voice dripping with artificial innocence. "I didn't even see you back here, Arthur. You blend in so perfectly with the catering staff." She leaned in closer, her heavy perfume completely overpowering the kitchen odors. "I hope you're comfortable," she whispered. We felt this placement was highly appropriate. "It's exactly where the remnants belong. You're just a remnant now, aren't you? You're the past we are systematically flushing away." I looked at her, this young woman who had married my son. I remembered when she first met Julian. She had seemed so sweet, or perhaps she was simply a superior actress back then. Now the mask was entirely gone. She was a scavenger, picking at the bones of a carcass she hadn't even hunted. "You look very nice, Clara," I said calmly. "Enjoy the music. It's incredibly expensive." She let out a sharp sneer. "Don't stress about the money. Harrison handled everything. The loose change in his couch cushions is more than you earned in a lifetime." She spun on her heel and strutted away, desperate to get back to the cameras and the center of attention. I watched her go, feeling a strange wave of pity. She truly believed she had won. She believed that kicking an old man's chair gave her power. She had absolutely no idea she was standing directly on a trapdoor, and I was the one holding the lever. I shifted my focus to the front of the room. The ceremony was about to commence. Harrison stood at the altar wearing a white tuxedo with sharp black lapels. To anyone else in the room, he likely appeared supremely confident. He was smiling, waving to the crowd, and shaking hands. But I pulled out my glasses, put them on, and focused my eyes. Harrison was physically melting. Despite the ballroom being kept at a crisp 68 degrees, beads of sweat were actively pouring down his forehead. His collar was visibly soaked. He kept rubbing his palms flat against his trousers, completely unable to stand still. His weight shifted erratically from one foot to the other as he adjusted his tie and toyed with his cufflinks. But the ultimate tell was the phone. Every 30 seconds, whenever he assumed no one was watching, he would slide the device out of his pocket, glance frantically at the screen, and shove it back inside. His expression would tighten for a fraction of a second, a micro-expression of pure, unadulterated panic, before he forced the smile back onto his face. I recognize that exact look. It's the expression a contractor gives when he suddenly realizes he forgot to install the load-bearing steel columns, and the concrete has already begun to pour. He was waiting for something, a wire transfer confirmation, a message, or perhaps a warning. Julian stood right beside him, his chest puffed out with immense pride. My son looked at Harrison with eyes full of absolute adoration. He didn't see the sweat. He didn't see the panic. He saw only the white tuxedo and the promise of millions. The orchestra's volume swelled. The wedding march began. The heavy double doors at the back of the hall swung open, and the entire room stood up, turning their heads to watch. Eleanor appeared. She wore a bridal gown encrusted with thousands of crystals, costing at least $20,000. A small tiara rested on her head. In a way, she looked striking, but she also looked entirely terrified. Her smile was completely fixed, frozen in place. She walked down the aisle, holding a bouquet of white roses so tightly her knuckles were translucent. She passed right by my table without a single glance. She didn't see the man who had loved her when she possessed nothing. She saw only the altar. She saw only the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. When she reached the front, Harrison stepped down to meet her, taking her hand. I watched him lean in close to whisper something into her ear. From a distance, it appeared incredibly romantic. The guests let out collective sighs of admiration. Next to me, great Aunt Martha, who was busy eating a roll she had smuggled in her purse, sighed loudly, "Oh, true love." But I can read lips. For 40 years, I had to communicate across noisy construction sites with crews and laborers over vast distances. I watched the movement of Harrison's mouth. He didn't say, "You look beautiful." He didn't say, "I love you." He said, "Did the wire transfer clear?" Eleanor's smile never faltered, but her eyes widened slightly. She whispered back, "I don't know. I gave you the confirmation code." Harrison gave a jerky, nervous nod. He patted her hand, but his eyes immediately flicked back toward his pocket, back toward the phone hidden inside his jacket. I leaned back into my chair. The pieces of the puzzle were locking perfectly into place. The rented Maybach, the fake diamonds, the desperate need for liquidity, and now the panic at the altar. Harrison wasn't just a con man. He was a desperate con man. He was running a Ponzi scheme that was collapsing in real time. He didn't need Eleanor's money for an investment. He needed it to pay off someone else, perhaps the venue, the caterers, or a shark far more dangerous than a bank loan officer. I looked around at the 500 guests, the politicians, the business owners, my own family. They were all watching a fairy tale. I was the only person in the room watching a robbery. The minister began to speak. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket, feeling the crisp paper of the police arrest record I had printed out at the Hotel Business Center. Right beside it was a second envelope, the one containing David's email and the facial recognition match. I had no intention of stopping this wedding. That would be entirely too easy. I wanted them to say, "I do." I wanted that knot tied so tight it couldn't be undone. When you demolish a compromised building, you don't halt the process halfway through. You wait until the entire structure fully succumbs to the laws of gravity, and only then do you pull the safety pin. I took a slow sip of my water. It had already turned lukewarm. "Go ahead, Harrison," I thought. "Say your vows. Promise to love and cherish. Because tonight, the only thing you'll be cherishing is your right to remain silent." From the front row, Clara turned around to glare at me, as if making sure I stayed exactly in my designated corner. I raised my water glass to her with a calm, steady smile. She had absolutely no clue. None of them did. The man they sat next to the restrooms was about to become the most important person in the entire room. Under the massive crystal chandeliers, the ceremony reached its absolute peak. The officiant, a man with a voice so deep he sounded like he belonged in a movie trailer, asked the fateful question, "Do you, Harrison Vance, take this woman to be your lawful, wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer?" Harrison didn't answer immediately. I watched his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard. He looked out at the audience, his eyes darting back and forth like a man scanning a room for the nearest emergency exit. He took a deep breath, his chest visibly trembling. "I do," he said. But he didn't stop there. He turned fully to Eleanor, grabbing both of her hands. Under the harsh stage lights, the sweat on his upper lip was now unmistakably glistening. He needed to sell this performance. He had to keep the illusion alive. "Eleanor," he announced, his voice projecting all the way to the back of the hall, right to my seat by the kitchen doors. "I don't just promise to be your husband. I promise to be your kingdom. I promise that from this day forward, you will never know scarcity. You will never know limitations. I'm going to take you to the top of the world, exactly where you belong. You aren't just marrying a man tonight, you are marrying a destiny." A collective gasp echoed through the crowd. Several women reached into their purses to wipe their eyes. Next to me, great Aunt Martha sighed loudly, muttering about how romantic it was, and how he spoke like a poet. I leaned back in my chair. He didn't sound like a poet. He sounded like a desperate politician trying to secure votes, right before a massive scandal breaks. I had heard variations of that exact speech before. I'd heard it from contractors promising to finish a project ahead of schedule and under budget, usually the day before they vanished with the advance payment. It was the language of overcompensation. When the structural foundation is weak, you plaster the exterior walls in gold paint. Eleanor devoured every single word. She looked at him with a level of adoration that made my stomach turn. Not because I still loved her. That ship had permanently sailed the moment she threw my keys onto the asphalt, but because I knew exactly how much that look was going to cost her. She believed him completely. She thought she had finally won the lottery, entirely unaware that she was clutching a worthless, expired ticket. "I do, Harrison," she sobbed into the microphone, "to my king." They exchanged rings. Harrison fumbled with the band, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped it onto the floor. He laughed it off with a high-pitched, nervous chuckle that completely contradicted his smooth persona. "Just a little overexcited, folks," he called out to the crowd. As he slid the ring onto her finger, I scanned the room once more. I am an observer by trade. It is my job to locate anomalies in the circuit, to find the frayed wire or the overheating fuse. And then my eyes locked onto him. He was seated at table 1, the VIP table reserved exclusively for the groom's closest family and primary business partners. He was the only person sitting there. He was a large man with broad shoulders, wearing a charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the ambient light. He wasn't watching the bride, and he wasn't looking at the groom. He was looking at his watch. Despite being indoors, he wore tinted lenses. In a room bursting with celebration, he sat in a state of completely unnatural stillness. When the couple finally kissed and the room erupted into thunderous applause, he didn't clap. He didn't smile. He simply reached down, picked up his glass of club soda, took a measured sip, and placed it back down precisely within the wet ring on the table. Harrison pulled away from the kiss, raising his arms in a display of victory. The orchestra struck up a triumphant melody, and the guests cheered. But Harrison's eyes didn't look toward his mother or Julian. They locked instantly onto table 1. He was looking directly at the man in the charcoal suit. The man in the gray suit gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a congratulatory gesture. It was the kind of nod a warden gives to an inmate, a confirmation of custody, absolute supervision. Harrison's smile froze on his face. He quickly turned back to Eleanor, burying his face into her neck to conceal his expression from the flashing cameras. I knew right then that the man wasn't a guest. He was a variable, a severe calculation error Harrison hadn't accounted for. Or perhaps a variable Harrison feared above all else. The ceremony concluded, and the guests began filtering out onto the terrace for the cocktail hour, while the ballroom was turned over for dinner. The air was thick with the chatter of 500 people, discussing the beauty of the vows and the staggering cost of the floral arrangements. I stood up, my legs stiff from the cheap chair. I needed data. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, sliding past groups of people effortlessly. No one stopped to speak to me. To them, I was just the discarded ex-husband, a complete non-factor, a shadow from the past. I was completely invisible, and when you are gathering intelligence, invisibility is a formidable tool. I spotted the man in the gray suit walking toward the bar. His stride was heavy and deliberate. He walked like he physically owned the floor beneath him. He radiated a cold aura that made the nearby socialites visually uncomfortable. He didn't order champagne or a cocktail. "Club soda with a lime," he told the bartender. I slid into the open space right next to him and ordered the exact same thing. "Nice ceremony," I said, keeping my eyes fixed straight ahead on the rows of liquor bottles. The man didn't look at me. He simply swirled the ice in his glass. "If you enjoy theater, sure," he replied. His voice was deep, gravelly and harsh, resembling the sound of heavy tires rolling over crushed stone. "You don't strike me as an art lover," I commented. "I'm a math lover," he answered plainly. "And the math in this room doesn't add up." I turned my head to evaluate him. Up close, his presence was even more imposing. A faint scar ran through his left eyebrow. His suit was expensive Italian tailoring, but he wore it like a tactical uniform, rather than a fashion statement. "I'm Arthur," I said, keeping my hands to myself. "I know exactly who you are," he replied, finally turning his head. Through the tinted lenses, I could feel his eyes measuring me up. "You're the ex-husband, the construction guy." "Structural engineer," I corrected. "Senior structural engineer." He let out a dry, humorless smirk. Right, the man who cleared out just in time. Cleared out? I asked. You're the only person in this entire room who isn't actively drowning, Arthur. You just don't realize it yet. He took a sip of his drink, looking over my shoulder toward the terrace where Harrison was posing for photos, holding a champagne glass high and laughing hysterically. Look at him, the man murmured. He looks like a guy who just won a race, completely oblivious to the fact that he's running on a treadmill. I decided to increase the voltage on the circuit to see what kind of spark it would generate. You're sitting at the VIP table, I noted, but you aren't family, and you certainly aren't a friend. Harrison looked at you during his vows like he had mortgaged his entire livelihood to you. The man let out a low, dark chuckle. Not his soul, Arthur, just his immediate future, or at least the version of it he's trying to sell to these people. He turned his body fully toward me, removing his glasses. His eyes were a cold, piercing gray, completely devoid of empathy. I'm not a guest. I am the sole reason this circus was allowed to happen in the first place. You think that 1.5 million from your old house was enough capital for him to play with? I began to see the true outline of the collapse. The man leaned in closer, bringing with him the scent of expensive tobacco and mint. Harrison Vance approached my organization 3 months ago. He needed major bridge capital. He claimed he had a wealthy fiancée, a historic brownstone to use as collateral, and a naive stepson who was ready to sign over an educational trust. My blood went completely cold. He knew about the house. He knew about Julian. He borrowed heavily, the man continued, under the kind of high-interest terms that would make a traditional bank manager physically ill. It's a hard money loan from the New York Underground Syndicate. He assured us that the moment the wedding gifts were processed and the joint accounts were merged, the debt would be settled in full. He is using this entire wedding as a high-stakes fundraising campaign. I looked out toward the terrace. I saw Julian laughing and shaking hands. I saw Eleanor flashing her ring to a group of friends. They were lambs to the slaughter, fat, happy, and completely oblivious to the butcher sitting right at the bar sipping club soda. And if he doesn't pay? I asked. The man readjusted his sunglasses, the gray lenses completely concealing his eyes once more. I'm the collection agency, Arthur, and I don't send late notices through the mail. He drained his drink in one swallow and slammed the empty glass down onto the marble bar. In the middle of that noisy room, the sound cracked like a single pistol shot. Congratulations on walking away clean, he said, adjusting his lapels. When it's time to cut the cake, you'll want to take a step back. Things are about to get incredibly messy. He turned on his heel, seamlessly melting into the sea of black tuxedos and designer gowns. I stood there, my hand gripping my club soda, my knuckles white. My hand was shaking, but it wasn't out of fear. It was pure, unadulterated anger. Harrison Vance wasn't just a low-level con man playing a game of smoke and mirrors. The man was genuinely dangerous. He had brought the cold, merciless shadow of an underground syndicate straight into my family. He had leveraged Julian's future and Eleanor's safety as absolute collateral for a debt he had zero capability of repaying. I looked out through the glass toward the terrace. Harrison was currently dipping Eleanor for the cameras, putting on a grand display of affection. I realized right then that the police report sitting in my jacket pocket wasn't just a tool for petty revenge anymore. It was an act of mercy. If I didn't systematically dismantle this illusion right now, the man in the gray suit was going to do it his way, and Eleanor and Julian would be caught directly in the crossfire. I dropped a $5 bill onto the bar, adjusted my tie, and prepared myself. The dinner service was concluding and the speeches were about to begin. Julian was scheduled to deliver the primary toast, and Harrison was prepared to boast about his empire. And I would be waiting at table T42 right by the restrooms. Because the man in the gray suit was right, I had cleared out. But I couldn't leave the structure just yet. I had to witness the precise moment the foundation collapsed, if only to ensure the debris didn't bury the innocent bystanders, assuming there were any left. I walked back to my table. Great Aunt Martha looked up at me, a stray breadcrumb clinging to her chin. "Who was that handsome gentleman you were speaking with?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Just a banker, Great Aunt Martha," I said, sliding back into my seat. "Just a banker." But I knew the objective truth. The man wasn't a banker. He was a liquidator, and he had arrived to collect a life. The dinner service had just wrapped up, and the catering staff was busy clearing away plates, still half laden with prime filet mignon and cold lobster tails. The sheer waste of it made my stomach churn, not because I was stingy, but because I deeply understood the exact value of labor. I knew precisely how many hours a working man had to stand on a freezing concrete deck just to finance a single plate at this table. But here, in a ballroom constructed on borrowed funds and stolen dreams, waste was celebrated as a metric of status. It was their way of demonstrating they possessed so much capital they simply didn't have to care. The main ballroom lights began to fade, shifting from a warm, ambient amber to a sharp, theatrical spotlight that sliced through the darkness and focused entirely on the head table. The ambient chatter died down completely. The clattering of silverware ceased. Julian stood up, smoothing the front of his tuxedo jacket. He looked sharp, I'll admit that much. He had my broad shoulders and his mother's easy smile. But as he accepted the microphone from the master of ceremonies, I looked at him and saw a complete stranger. His posture was arrogant, his chin tilted upward, in a flawless, practiced imitation of Harrison's bravado. He tapped the top of the microphone twice. Thump! Thump! The sound reverberated heavily through the massive house speakers. "Ladies, gentlemen, distinguished guests, and my brand-new family," Julian began, his delivery smooth, polished, and thoroughly rehearsed in front of a mirror. He paused for dramatic effect, letting his gaze sweep across the high-profile VIP tables in the front row. He never looked toward the back of the pavilion. He didn't glance at table T42, where I sat right next to the kitchen doors and the commercial ice machine. "We are here today to celebrate love," Julian continued, his voice projecting with confidence. "But for me, today represents something far greater than a wedding. It is an awakening. It's the precise moment I realized that life doesn't have to be an endless struggle. It doesn't have to be a slow, painful climb up a ladder that leads to absolute obscurity." I took a slow sip of my lukewarm water. I knew exactly where this trajectory was headed. "Growing up," Julian said, his tone dropping into a somber, almost tragic register, "I was constantly taught that money was scarce. I was conditioned to believe you had to hoard every single penny. I was told that dreaming big was inherently dangerous because the fall would break you. My entire childhood was defined by the word no. No, we can't afford that vacation. No, that vehicle is too expensive. No, we don't take risks." Around the room, several guests nodded along sympathetically, likely thinking of how traumatic it must have been to grow up with a father who paid his bills on time and meticulously saved for a college education. "I was raised entirely in the shadow of fear," Julian declared, tightening his grip on the microphone stand. "I was brought up under a mindset that equated mere survival with actual living. Now I love my biological father, wherever he is." He offered a dismissive wave toward the back of the room, not even bothering to locate me. It was a careless gesture, the kind you use to swat away a nuisance. But he is a man who belongs permanently in the past. He's a relic of the industrial age. He knows how to patch up broken things, but he possesses absolutely no concept of how to construct a new empire. I felt a sharp pang in my chest, but I suppressed it immediately. I am an engineer. I analyzed the data of his statement. I patched things up. Yes, I did. I personally reinforced the electrical grid currently powering the microphone he was using to insult me. I designed the structural safety systems of the hospital where he was born. He viewed labor as a failure. I viewed it as the literal foundation of civilization. But then Julian's face illuminated with a fanatical energy, and he turned fully toward Harrison. And then I met Harrison Vance. The room erupted into applause. Harrison beamed with pride, waving to the crowd like a king acknowledging his subjects. "Harrison didn't just step into my mother's life," Julian shouted over the noise, his voice rising with emotion. "He stepped into mine. He demonstrated to me that a man isn't defined by what he saves, but by the massive value he creates. He taught me that the only real limitations are the ones you place on yourself. In just 6 months, Harrison has taught me more about business, about courage, and about what it truly means to be a man than I learned in 32 years of absolute mediocrity. Mediocrity. The word hung heavily in the air. Eleanor was openly weeping now, dabbing her eyes with a silk napkin, looking at Julian with overwhelming pride. She thought it was beautiful. She believed her son was finally expressing his true potential, entirely blind to the fact that he was actively delivering a eulogy for his own character. "Harrison is the father I never had," Julian proclaimed at the top of his lungs. The ballroom went dead silent for a fraction of a second before completely erupting. Guests stood up from their tables, cheering and whistling. It was a standing ovation for an act of total betrayal. I sat perfectly still. I didn't slouch, and I didn't lower my head. I looked my son dead in the eye from across the room as he systematically traded our history to secure the favor of a thief. "He is a visionary!" Julian shouted over the roar of the applause. "He is a titan, and it is the honor of my life to finally call him Dad." He hoisted his crystal champagne flute high into the air, the glass capturing the bright glare of the spotlight. "So, I want to propose a toast," Julian said, waiting for the room to settle for the final crescendo. "To Harrison and Eleanor. To a union of elegance and absolute power. To the future, a future where we don't count pennies, we count millions. A future where we don't work for capital, but we make capital work for us. To the Vance family legacy." "To the Vance legacy!" The crowd roared back in unison, 500 voices chanting the name. Julian held the glass at the apex of its reach, his mouth opening to deliver the final word of his speech. Perhaps he was going to say cheers. Perhaps he was going to say salute. We will never know. In that exact microsecond, a loud, violent thump vibrated through the entire structure of the ballroom. It sounded like a gunshot to the untrained ear, but I knew the acoustics immediately. It was the sound of a main commercial circuit breaker, tripping under a massive forced overload. A high-frequency shriek of microphone feedback tore through the house speakers, causing the entire room to wince and cover their ears. And then came the darkness. Absolute total darkness. The spotlights died instantly. The crystal chandeliers went dark. Even the illuminated emergency exit signs flickered twice and died. The hum of the industrial air conditioning units groaned in protest before winding down to a complete halt. The only remaining illumination in the entire pavilion came from the pale, ghostly blue glow of smartphones, reflecting off hundreds of confused faces. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the heavy, shocking quiet that immediately follows a catastrophic car accident. Then the frantic whispering began. What happened? Is there a storm? Did a transformer blow? I sat calmly in the dark, my hands resting steadily on my water glass. I didn't move, and I didn't panic. I knew precisely what had occurred. This wasn't a technical glitch. An estate of this caliber operates on heavy-duty automatic backup generators. If this were a simple grid failure, the auxiliary power would have kicked in within 10 seconds. But 10 seconds passed, then 20. The room remained pitch black. This was a manual disconnection, a total termination of service. I looked toward the front of the room. In the dim ambient light of a few smartphone screens, I spotted Harrison. He was frozen in place. He wasn't looking at the ceiling, and he wasn't calling for the venue manager. His eyes were locked in a dead stare, straight toward the main entrance doors. Julian was frantically tapping the dead microphone, looking completely bewildered. "Dad? Harrison? What's going on with the power?" I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water. It tasted crisp and clear now. I felt a frantic tap on my shoulder. It was Great Aunt Martha, her voice trembling in the dark. "Arthur, is this part of the entertainment? Is it a surprise?" I gently patted her hand in the darkness. "Yes, Great Aunt Martha," I whispered softly. "It's a surprise. The main event is just getting started." I shifted my gaze toward the service entrance at the back of the hall. Over the murmurs of the crowd, I could hear the distinct, synchronized thud of heavy leather boots moving across the parquetry floor. It wasn't the frantic, shuffling pace of catering staff trying to resolve an electrical issue. It was the measured, authoritative stride of men arriving to take absolute control of a situation. Julian had just toasted to a future where they didn't count pennies. He was about to learn that when you stop counting, someone else begins doing the math for you. And when the accounts come up short, they turn off the lights. The darkness wasn't an accident. It was an invoice, and it was severely past due. The darkness didn't last forever, but the suffocating silence did. When the backup generators finally kicked in, they didn't restore the warm golden ambiance of the expensive crystal chandeliers. Instead, harsh, blue-white industrial emergency floodlights flickered to life, casting long, distorted shadows across the ballroom. The fairy tale illusion vanished instantly, replaced by the cold, clinical glare of a warehouse or an interrogation room. It exposed absolutely everything. It exposed the cheap, caked-on foundation on Clara's face, the sweat completely soaking through Harrison's shirt, and the unadulterated terror in Eleanor's eyes. As it adapted to the emergency circuit, the microphone system popped and hissed. A high-frequency shriek of feedback pierced through the room, making all 500 guests wince simultaneously. Harrison was the first to move. He was a creature who survived entirely on predatory instinct, and his immediate instinct was to deny reality. He tapped the microphone, forcing a wide grin that looked more like a painful muscle spasm. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, his baritone voice echoing strangely in the room's terrible acoustic dead zones. "A minor technical glitch. It seems my energy was just too powerful for the local grid to handle. Let's have a round of applause for the staff working tirelessly to get us back to 100%. A few people clapped politely, mostly out of sheer confusion, but the applause died down almost instantly, because someone else was walking up the steps to the stage. It wasn't a technician. It wasn't the wedding planner. It was the general manager of the estate. I knew his reputation. He was a man who managed hospitalities with the ruthless efficiency of a Swiss watchmaker. He strode directly up to the head table, his posture dripping with cold corporate authority. In one hand, he held a wireless payment terminal. In the other, a heavy black folder. He wasn't smiling, and he didn't apologize for the interruption. He marched straight up to Harrison. Harrison tried to wave him off dismissively, cupping his hand over the microphone. "Not right now, Henry," he hissed under his breath. "We are in the middle of the toasts." But Harrison forgot one crucial detail. In his panic, he only covered the side of the microphone, not the top, and the gain on the emergency backup system was dialed all the way to maximum. "Mr. Vance," the manager spoke. He didn't shout, but amplified by the house speakers, his voice was deafening. It carried cleanly into every single corner of the pavilion, right down to table T42, where I sat next to the kitchen doors. "We have an immediate issue regarding your second installment payment." Harrison let out a nervous chuckle, attempting to shift his body to block the manager from the audience's view. "An issue? I'm completely certain it's just a routine wire delay. My bankers in Zurich are likely at lunch. We'll get it straightened out first thing Monday morning." The manager didn't budge. He took a step forward, invading Harrison's personal space. "Sir, we have attempted to process the 3 primary credit cards you provided on file. The American Express Centurion, the Visa Infinite, and your corporate MasterCard." Harrison was visibly dripping sweat now. Under the stark emergency lighting, his composure was completely dissolving. Yes, I'm aware. Large transactions often trigger immediate security protocols. When you operate at my level of capital, it's standard procedure." "Mr. Vance," the manager interrupted, his delivery cutting like ice, "those cards did not trigger a routine security hold. They triggered a global anti-fraud alert. 2 of those accounts have been flagged as actively stolen, belonging to a physician in Florida named Dr. Peter Stary-Niski. The 3rd card was declined for insufficient funds. The available balance on that account is $12. The ballroom went so silent you could hear the faint hum of the industrial ventilation fans. 500 people stopped breathing in unison. Silverware remained suspended mid-air. "Stolen?" someone whispered at a neighboring table. $12? Another guest muttered. I leaned back in my chair and crossed my arms. There it was. The first brick had collapsed. Gravity was taking complete control of the structure. Harrison's face turned a shade I had never witnessed on a human being before, a sickly mottled mix of gray and purple. He looked frantically at the crowd, then at the manager, then down at the microphone. He realized entirely too late that every single person in the room had heard every word. "This is completely preposterous," Harrison sputtered wildly, attempting to summon a shred of righteous indignation. "Do you have any concept of who I am? I could buy this entire venue and have you terminated by morning. This is a banking error, an absolute algorithmic malfunction." The manager raised the wireless terminal, its screen flashing a stark, angry red. "Sir, the explicit terms of the contract dictate that 50% of the catering costs must be cleared prior to the main course being served. That amount is $300,000. If we do not receive valid payment immediately, kitchen operations will cease. The staff will be sent home, and I will contact local authorities to report the unauthorized use of stolen financial instruments." $300,000. Harrison looked around the room like a trapped animal. He locked eyes with Julian, who was staring back at him with his mouth wide open, looking exactly like a fish that had just been dragged onto a pier. He looked toward his supposed business partners at the VIP tables, but they had all suddenly developed a profound fascination with their phones or the ceiling panels. The man in the charcoal suit, the true creditor, merely watched, swiveling his club soda. A predator, thoroughly enjoying the performance. Harrison did the only thing a coward knows how to do. He shifted the burden. "Eleanor, my love," he said, turning sharply to my ex-wife. He forced his most charming smile, but under the blue light, it looked like a ghoulish mask. "Hand your card to Mr. Henry, the black one. You know how difficult the banks get with my international transfers. We'll get this sorted out by morning. Just cover the catering costs for now." He extended his hand, expecting her to rescue him, expecting her to be the safety net she had always been. Eleanor sat frozen solid in her chair, her small tiara sitting slightly askew on her head. Her face was completely pale, entirely drained of color. She stared at Harrison's extended palm, then looked up at his face. "Harrison," she whispered. Her voice was trembling, but the microphone captured the audio flawlessly. "What exactly do you mean?" "Just give him the card, sweetheart," Harrison urged, his delivery growing tense and sharp. "We don't want our distinguished guests waiting on their lobster." Eleanor slowly rose to her feet, moving as if she were trapped underwater. She clutched her sequined purse tightly against her chest. I can't," she stammered. "What do you mean you can't?" Harrison snapped, his thin veneer of patience snapping entirely. "Give him the card." "I don't have a single cent left, Harrison," Eleanor screamed. The sound tore through the pavilion, a shriek of pure, unadulterated panic. "What?" Harrison stepped back, staring at her as if she were speaking an entirely foreign language. "I gave you absolutely everything," she cried, tears actively streaming down her cheeks, completely ruining her makeup. "This morning in the bridal suite, you told me you needed immediate liquidity to finalize the Costa Rican land acquisition before the markets opened. You said the entire deal would collapse if I didn't hand over everything." Harrison froze completely, his eyes darting toward the crowd, then toward the camera crew who were actively zooming in on his face. "I wired every dollar to your account," Eleanor sobbed, her voice completely broken. "The $1.5 million from the brownstone refinance, my entire savings account, even my retirement fund. You swore you would triple it by tonight. You said the wedding expenses would be covered entirely from the returns." The silence in the ballroom was absolute and heavy, the kind of silence that accompanies a truth so massive it displaces all the oxygen in the room. Eleanor turned to the manager, pointing a trembling finger at Harrison. "He has the funds. He took all my money. Demand it from him." The manager turned his gaze to Harrison. It was no longer the look of a polite hospitality executive. It was the look of a man who realized he was dealing with a criminal. "Mr. Vance?" the manager asked. "Is this accurate? Can you provide an alternative method of payment using those assets?" Harrison opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He stared down at his phone, frantically tapping the screen as if searching for an escape hatch, a magic button that would make capital materialize out of thin air. It's in an escrow account," Harrison mumbled, his voice reduced to a barely audible whisper. "It's locked in an offshore structure. Liquidation takes time." "Liar!" The word boomed from the front row. It didn't come from Eleanor. It came from Julian. My son surged to his feet, knocking his chair completely backward onto the floor. He stared at Harrison with an expression of horror and betrayal that was genuinely painful to watch. Ni gao suo, zijin chi shi ji shida, Julian shouted. An hour ago, you forced me to sign the transfer documents for the trust fund, claiming you needed to bundle the capital. You swore you had cash on hand. I took a slow sip of my water, the glass feeling crisp against my fingers. So he really had attempted to liquidate the 529 educational fund. I felt a wave of cold satisfaction knowing that the document Julian had handed him was completely worthless text. The capital was perfectly secure, locked tightly behind the restrictive covenant I had written in the margin. Harrison had stolen nothing but a piece of paper, but he had taken absolutely everything else. Harrison looked from Julian to Eleanor and then straight toward the emergency exit signs. "Everyone, please remain calm," Harrison said, lifting his hands in a gesture of surrender. "There is a perfectly logical explanation for this. Market volatility in the digital asset sector caused a temporary freeze. The capital is secure. It is simply inaccessible for the next 24 hours. "Inaccessible!" Eleanor shrieked. She lunged forward, grabbing the lapels of his white tuxedo jacket. "You told me you bought this entire estate. You swore this property belonged to you, and now they're demanding credit cards from you? I am in the active process of negotiating the acquisition," Harrison lied, desperately trying to pry her manicured fingers off his jacket. "It's a highly complex structured buyout." "Sir," the manager interrupted, stepping firmly between them. He signaled to two large security guards standing by the double doors. "I must ask you to accompany us to the administrative office. We will be contacting the local authorities to resolve the matter regarding these stolen credit cards." "No!" Harrison shouted, violently shoving Eleanor back. She stumbled blindly, crashing into her chair and burying her face in her hands. "I'm going absolutely nowhere," Harrison yelled, his voice cracking under the strain. "This is an absolute setup. You're all just envious of my success." He looked around the room, his eyes wild and desperate, searching for an ally, his gaze locked onto table 1. "Help me!" he shrieked at the man in the charcoal suit. Tell them about our partnership. Tell them the capital is on the way." The man in the charcoal suit didn't stand up. He didn't say a word. He simply picked up his linen napkin, wiped his mouth, and slowly shook his head. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a phone, and made a call. He wasn't calling a banker. He was calling his crew to cut their losses and clear out. Harrison turned desperately back to the stage. "Julian, handle this. Use your card. I'll reimburse you threefold tomorrow." Julian just stood there, his pockets pulled completely inside out, entirely empty. "I gave you my card yesterday, Harrison," Julian whispered, his voice trembling. "You said you needed it to upgrade the honeymoon suite." The house of cards hadn't just collapsed. It had completely atomized. I sat in the back, observing the wreckage. The lobster would never be served. The cake would never be cut. The orchestra had permanently stopped playing. I looked over at Clara. She was frantically deleting posts from her Instagram account, desperately erasing the evidence of her boasting, trying to scrub any association with the absolute disaster unfolding in front of her. I rose from my seat. The production was over. The grand finale had arrived, and it was brutal. But there was still one final act to play out. The police were en route, but before they arrived, the truth required a final witness. I walked toward the front of the pavilion. The crowd parted for me effortlessly. I wasn't the invisible man anymore. In a room packed with bankrupt fools, a man with a transit card and a clean conscience was king. As Harrison saw me approaching, his eyes locked onto mine. For the first time since I had met him, the arrogance was entirely gone from his face. He looked at me with pure recognition. He knew that I held the data. "Arthur," he wheezed, drenched in sweat. "Arthur, tell them I'm good for the capital. You understand business. You know how these structured transactions work." I stopped right at the head table. I looked at Eleanor, sobbing into her ruined, expensive gown. I looked at Julian, broken and completely hollowed out. And I looked at Harrison, the architect of their destruction. I reached into my pocket. I didn't pull out a checkbook. I pulled out the police report. I placed it gently on the table, right next to the live microphone. I don't know much about high finance, Harrison, I said, my calm, steady voice projecting flawlessly through the house speakers. I'm just a simple structural engineer. But I do know that when a building collapses, it's usually because someone cut corners on the foundation. I turned my attention to the manager. Manager, I said, pointing down at the document, I believe this might assist with your paperwork. His name isn't Harrison Vance. That is a copy of his active arrest warrant out of the state of Texas. The liquidation was complete, and it hadn't cost me a single penny. 阶梯之火熄灭后的寂静是绝对的，那是一种沉重、令人窒息的静止，通常只会发生在暴风雨前的四季中。The police report lay on the white silk tablecloth like a radioactive object. Harrison stared at it, his eyes protruding, his chest heaving violently beneath his sweat-soaked tuxedo shirt. He looked exactly like a man who had run a 10-year marathon only to smash headfirst into a concrete wall. But before Harrison could sputter out another fabrication, before he could spin another grand tale of misunderstood genius and banking glitches, a sharp, grating screech echoed through the hall. It was the sound of a chair being pushed back deliberately across the parquetry floor. At the VIP table, the man in the charcoal suit stood up. He didn't rush, and he didn't look angry. He buttoned his jacket with a slow, methodical elegance that was far more terrifying than any shouting. Adjusting his tinted lenses, he picked up his glass of club soda and walked directly toward the stage. The crowd instinctively backed away from him. He possessed an aura, a gravitational field of sheer authority that made local politicians and executives step aside. He walked up the steps to the head table, his heavy boots resonating perfectly with the pounding of 500 anxious hearts. He stopped right beside me, looking down at the police report I had placed on the table. He gave a single slow nod, a gesture of professional respect. "You're missing a page, Arthur," he said. His voice was deep, gravelly, and projected effortlessly across the room without the aid of a microphone. But for a preliminary assessment, this is completely accurate. He reached into his internal pocket and pulled out a thick manila envelope, tossing it onto the table right next to my paperwork. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. Harrison, or Howard, as his true records indicated, winced as if he had been physically struck. "Who is this?" Eleanor shrieked, her voice high-pitched and bordering on complete hysteria. She looked back and forth between me and the stranger, her eyes wild with confusion. "Is he a business partner? Is he the banker? Harrison, tell them who he is." Harrison couldn't speak. He was hyperventilating, shaking his head frantically at the stranger, begging with his eyes, a silent plea to stop, to remain silent. The stranger completely ignored him. He turned toward Eleanor, removing his glasses to reveal the cold, piercing gray eyes that had analyzed me at the bar. "I am not a banker, ma'am," he said clearly. "My name is Investigator Miller. I am a licensed private investigator out of the state of Texas, and I am currently retained by Mrs. Sarah Fisk." Eleanor blinked, a tear tracing a path down her chin. Who? Who is Sarah Fisk?" The stranger smiled, but it was entirely devoid of warmth. It was the grin of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey. "She is the woman who has been married to this man for 15 years, he said, pointing a finger directly at Harrison. "She is the mother of his 3 children in Houston, and she is the woman he entirely drained of her life savings 6 months ago before vanishing to find a new target." A collective gasp ripped through the pavilion, a physical sound like all the oxygen being simultaneously vacuumed out of the ballroom. "Married?" someone whispered. "3 kids," another muttered. Eleanor grabbed the edge of the table to steady herself. Her knees buckled completely, and she collapsed back into her chair, her white gown deflating around her like a punctured parachute. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "That's impossible. We just got married. I signed the documents. There is a valid marriage license. The license is completely void," the investigator said, his voice cutting through her denial like a scalpel. "You cannot legally marry a man who is already wed. This entire ceremony was a fraud. The vows are null. Frankly, considering he used a fraudulent alias on the application, I doubt those papers will even make it past the county clerk's wastebasket. He turned his gray eyes back onto Harrison. "Hello, Howard," he said softly. "It's been a long chase. You're an incredibly difficult man to pin down. You change identities the way most men change their socks. Harrison Vance, Arthur Wayne, Marcus Gold. You certainly possess a vivid imagination." Harrison finally found his voice, letting out a high-pitched, strangled shriek. "This is absolute defamation!" he screamed, backing up until he crashed into the DJ booth. "I don't know this person. He's an actor. Arthur hired him. This is a complete setup." The investigator let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "A setup?" he countered. He reached down, grabbed the heavy envelope he had thrown onto the table, and tore it completely open. Photographs spilled out across the silk, dozens of them. "Here you are in Miami, selling non-existent resort properties to retirees," the investigator narrated, tossing a photo into the crowd. "Here you are in Dallas, operating a fraudulent charity scam for veterans. And here you are just last week in New York, meeting with a hard money lending syndicate because your Ponzi scheme was running completely dry." He looked out at the audience, addressing the 500 guests who were now standing, recording the entire spectacle on their phones, witnessing the total dismantling of a social climber. "Here is the raw data, folks," the investigator announced. "A classic Ponzi structure. He used the capital from his new bride to cover the debts of his past life. That Costa Rican eco-resort he promised a 300% return on? There is no resort. There is no infrastructure. There is only a shell account in the Cayman Islands that he used to finance his custom suits and his rented Maybach." Julian stepped forward, looking like an absolute ghost, his face a dull shade of ash. He reached down and picked up one of the stray photographs. It showed Harrison standing outside a fast food restaurant, wearing a faded uniform. The timestamp was from merely 2 years prior. You worked a fry station?" Julian whispered, his voice cracking with a terrifying realization. Harrison aggressively snatched the photo away. "I was performing corporate due diligence for a franchise investment portfolio." But Julian wasn't listening anymore. Reality was crushing him under its immense weight. The stock options, the vice president title, the millions of dollars, it was all smoke. "Where is the trust fund?" Julian asked, his voice shaking with pure rage. "The document I signed tonight. Where is it?" Harrison's eyes darted wildly. "It's secure. It's actively being processed." "It's gone," the investigator corrected smoothly. "Or rather, it would be gone if your father hadn't been intelligent enough to lock it down with a restrictive covenant. But the rest of it, the brownstone refinance capital, the savings, the alimony," he turned his focus to Eleanor. "Mrs. Pendleton, I am deeply sorry to inform you that 3 hours ago he wired your entire $1.5 million to an offshore sports betting website. He attempted to double the capital on a soccer match in Brazil." I looked up, meeting the investigator's gaze. It was the first time I had spoken since he stepped onto the stage. "Did he win?" I asked. The investigator looked at me and slowly shook his head. "He bet on the underdog, Arthur. He lost absolutely everything." The darkness didn't last forever, but the suffocating silence did. When the backup generators finally kicked in, they didn't restore the warm, golden ambiance of the expensive crystal chandeliers. Instead, harsh, blue-white industrial emergency floodlights flickered to life, casting long, distorted shadows across the ballroom. The fairy tale illusion vanished instantly, replaced by the cold, clinical glare of a warehouse or an interrogation room. It exposed absolutely everything. It exposed the cheap, caked-on foundation on Clara's face, the sweat completely soaking through Harrison's shirt, and the unadulterated terror in Eleanor's eyes. As it adapted to the emergency circuit, the microphone system popped and hissed. A high-frequency shriek of feedback pierced through the room, making all 500 guests wince simultaneously. Harrison was the first to move. He was a creature who survived entirely on predatory instinct, and his immediate instinct was to deny reality. He tapped the microphone, forcing a wide grin that looked more like a painful muscle spasm. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, his baritone voice echoing strangely in the room's terrible acoustic dead zones. "A minor technical glitch. It seems my energy was just too powerful for the local grid to handle. Let's have a round of applause for the staff working tirelessly to get us back to 100%. A few people clapped politely, mostly out of sheer confusion, but the applause died down almost instantly, because someone else was walking up the steps to the stage. It wasn't a technician. It wasn't the wedding planner. It was the general manager of the estate. I knew his reputation. He was a man who managed hospitalities with the ruthless efficiency of a Swiss watchmaker. He strode directly up to the head table, his posture dripping with cold corporate authority. In one hand, he held a wireless payment terminal. In the other, a heavy black folder. He wasn't smiling, and he didn't apologize for the interruption. He marched straight up to Harrison. Harrison tried to wave him off dismissively, cupping his hand over the microphone. "Not right now, Henry," he hissed under his breath. "We are in the middle of the toasts." But Harrison forgot one crucial detail. In his panic, he only covered the side of the microphone, not the top, and the gain on the emergency backup system was dialed all the way to maximum. "Mr. Vance," the manager spoke. He didn't shout, but amplified by the house speakers, his voice was deafening. It carried cleanly into every single corner of the pavilion, right down to table T42, where I sat next to the kitchen doors. "We have an immediate issue regarding your second installment payment." Harrison let out a nervous chuckle, attempting to shift his body to block the manager from the audience's view. "An issue? I'm completely certain it's just a routine wire delay. My bankers in Zurich are likely at lunch. We'll get it straightened out first thing Monday morning." The manager didn't budge. He took a step forward, invading Harrison's personal space. "Sir, we have attempted to process the 3 primary credit cards you provided on file. The American Express Centurion, the Visa Infinite, and your corporate MasterCard." Harrison was visibly dripping sweat now. Under the stark emergency lighting, his composure was completely dissolving. Yes, I'm aware. Large transactions often trigger immediate security protocols. When you operate at my level of capital, it's standard procedure." "Mr. Vance," the manager interrupted, his delivery cutting like ice. "Those cards did not trigger a routine security hold. They triggered a global anti-fraud alert. 2 of those accounts have been flagged as actively stolen, belonging to a physician in Florida named Dr. Peter Stariniski. The 3rd card was declined for insufficient funds. The available balance on that account is $12. The ballroom went so silent you could hear the faint hum of the industrial ventilation fans. 500 people stopped breathing in unison. Silverware remained suspended mid-air. "Stolen?" someone whispered at a neighboring table. $12? Another guest muttered. I leaned back in my chair and crossed my arms. There it was. The first brick had collapsed. Gravity was taking complete control of the structure. Harrison's face turned a shade I had never witnessed on a human being before. A sickly mottled mix of gray and purple. He looked frantically at the crowd, then at the manager, then down at the microphone. He realized entirely too late that every single person in the room had heard every word. "This is completely preposterous," Harrison sputtered wildly, attempting to summon a shred of righteous indignation. "Do you have any concept of who I am? I could buy this entire venue and have you terminated by morning. This is a banking error, an absolute algorithmic malfunction." The manager raised the wireless terminal, its screen flashing a stark, angry red. "Sir, the explicit terms of the contract dictate that 50% of the catering costs must be cleared prior to the main course being served. That amount is $300,000. If we do not receive valid payment immediately, kitchen operations will cease. The staff will be sent home, and I will contact local authorities to report the unauthorized use of stolen financial instruments." $300,000. Harrison looked around the room like a trapped animal. He locked eyes with Julian, who was staring back at him with his mouth wide open, looking exactly like a fish that had just been dragged onto a pier. He looked toward his supposed business partners at the VIP tables, but they had all suddenly developed a profound fascination with their phones or the ceiling panels. The man in the charcoal suit, the true creditor, merely watched, swiveling his club soda, a predator thoroughly enjoying the performance. Harrison did the only thing a coward knows how to do. He shifted the burden. "Eleanor, my love, he said, turning sharply to my ex-wife. He forced his most charming smile, but under the blue light, it looked like a ghoulish mask. Hand your card to Mr. Henry, the black one. You know how difficult the banks get with my international transfers. We'll get this sorted out by morning. Just cover the catering costs for now. He extended his hand, expecting her to rescue him, expecting her to be the safety net she had always been. Eleanor sat frozen solid in her chair, her small tiara sitting slightly askew on her head. Her face was completely pale, entirely drained of color. She stared at Harrison's extended palm, then looked up at his face. "Harrison," she whispered. Her voice was trembling, but the microphone captured the audio flawlessly. "What exactly do you mean? Just give him the card, sweetheart," Harrison urged, his delivery growing tense and sharp. "We don't want our distinguished guests waiting on their lobster." Eleanor slowly rose to her feet, moving as if she were trapped underwater. She clutched her sequined purse tightly against her chest. I can't," she stammered. "What do you mean you can't?" Harrison snapped, his thin veneer of patience snapping entirely. "Give him the card." "I don't have a single cent left, Harrison," Eleanor screamed. The sound tore through the pavilion, a shriek of pure, unadulterated panic. "What?" Harrison stepped back, staring at her as if she were speaking an entirely foreign language. "I gave you absolutely everything," she cried, tears actively streaming down her cheeks, completely ruining her makeup. "This morning in the bridal suite, you told me you needed immediate liquidity to finalize the Costa Rican land acquisition before the markets opened. You said the entire deal would collapse if I didn't hand over everything." Harrison froze completely, his eyes darting toward the crowd, then toward the camera crew who were actively zooming in on his face. "I wired every dollar to your account," Eleanor sobbed, her voice completely broken. "The $1.5 million from the brownstone refinance, my entire savings account, even my retirement fund. You swore you would triple it by tonight. You said the wedding expenses would be covered entirely from the returns." The silence in the ballroom was absolute and heavy, the kind of silence that accompanies a truth so massive it displaces all the oxygen in the room. Eleanor turned to the manager, pointing a trembling finger at Harrison. "He has the funds. He took all my money. Demand it from him." The manager turned his gaze to Harrison. It was no longer the look of a polite hospitality executive. It was the look of a man who realized he was dealing with a criminal. "Mr. Vance," the manager asked, "is this accurate? Can you provide an alternative method of payment using those assets?" Harrison opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He stared down at his phone, frantically tapping the screen as if searching for an escape hatch, a magic button that would make capital materialize out of thin air. It's in an escrow account," Harrison mumbled, his voice reduced to a barely audible whisper. "It's locked in an offshore structure. Liquidation takes time." "Liar!" The word boomed from the front row. It didn't come from Eleanor. It came from Julian. My son surged to his feet, knocking his chair completely backward onto the floor. He stared at Harrison with an expression of horror and betrayal that was genuinely painful to watch. "You told me the capital pool was instant," Julian shouted. "An hour ago, you forced me to sign the transfer documents for the trust fund, claiming you needed to bundle the capital. You swore you had cash on hand." I took a slow sip of my water, the glass feeling crisp against my fingers. So he really had attempted to liquidate the 529 educational fund. I felt a wave of cold satisfaction knowing that the document Julian had handed him was completely worthless text. The capital was perfectly secure, locked tightly behind the restrictive covenant I had written in the margin. Harrison had stolen nothing but a piece of paper, but he had taken absolutely everything else. Harrison looked from Julian to Eleanor and then straight toward the emergency exit signs. "Everyone, please remain calm," Harrison said, lifting his hands in a gesture of surrender. "There is a perfectly logical explanation for this. Market volatility in the digital sector caused a temporary freeze. The capital is secure. It is simply inaccessible for the next 24 hours. "Inaccessible?" Eleanor shrieked. She lunged forward, grabbing the lapels of his white tuxedo jacket. "You told me you bought this entire estate. You swore this property belonged to you, and now they're demanding credit cards from you. I am in the active process of negotiating the acquisition, Harrison lied, desperately trying to pry her manicured fingers off his jacket. It's a highly complex structured buyout. Sir, the manager interrupted, stepping firmly between them. He signaled to two large security guards standing by the double doors. I must ask you to accompany us to the administrative office. We will be contacting the local authorities to resolve the matter regarding these stolen credit cards. No! Harrison shouted, violently shoving Eleanor back. She stumbled blindly, crashing into her chair and burying her face in her hands. I'm going absolutely nowhere, Harrison yelled, his voice cracking under the strain. This is an absolute setup. You're all just envious of my success. He looked around the room, his eyes wild and desperate, searching for an ally. His gaze locked onto table 1. Help me! He shrieked at the man in the charcoal suit. Tell them about our partnership. Tell them the capital is on the way. The man in the charcoal suit didn't stand up. He didn't say a word. He simply picked up his linen napkin, wiped his mouth, and slowly shook his head. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a phone, and made a call. He wasn't calling a banker. He was calling his crew to cut their losses and clear out. Harrison turned desperately back to the stage. Julian, handle this. Use your card. I'll reimburse you threefold tomorrow. Julian just stood there, his pockets pulled completely inside out, entirely empty. I gave you my card yesterday, Harrison, Julian whispered, his voice trembling. You said you needed it to upgrade the honeymoon suite. The house of cards hadn't just collapsed. It had completely atomized. I sat in the back, observing the wreckage. The lobster would never be served. The cake would never be cut. The orchestra had permanently stopped playing. I looked over at Clara. She was frantically deleting posts from her Instagram account, desperately erasing the evidence of her boasting, trying to scrub any association with the absolute disaster unfolding in front of her. I rose from my seat. The production was over. The grand finale had arrived, and it was brutal. But there was still one final act to play out. The police were en route, but before they arrived, the truth required a final witness. I walked toward the front of the pavilion. The crowd parted for me effortlessly. I wasn't the invisible man anymore. In a room packed with bankrupt fools, a man with a transit card and a clean conscience was king. As Harrison saw me approaching, his eyes locked onto mine. For the first time since I had met him, the arrogance was entirely gone from his face. He looked at me with pure recognition. He knew that I held the data. Arthur, he wheezed, drenched in sweat. Arthur, tell them. Tell them I'm good for the capital. You understand business. You know how these structured transactions work. I stopped right at the head table. I looked at Eleanor, sobbing into her ruined, expensive gown. I looked at Julian, broken and completely hollowed out. And I looked at Harrison, the architect of their destruction. I reached into my pocket. I didn't pull out a checkbook. I pulled out the police report. I placed it gently on the table, right next to the live microphone. I don't know much about high finance, Harrison, I said, my wallet safe, my voice projecting flawlessly through the house speakers. I'm just a simple structural engineer, but I do know that when a building collapses, it's usually because someone cut corners on the foundation. I turned my attention to the manager. Manager, I said, pointing down at the document, I believe this might assist with your paperwork. His name isn't Harrison Vance. That is a copy of his active arrest warrant out of the state of Texas. The liquidation was complete, and it hadn't cost me a single penny. The silence that followed my declaration was absolute. That heavy, suffocating stillness that typically precedes a massive natural disaster. The police report lay on the white silk tablecloth like a radioactive object. Harrison stared at it, his eyes protruding, his chest heaving violently beneath his sweat-soaked tuxedo shirt. He looked exactly like a man who had run a 10-year marathon, only to smash headfirst into a concrete wall. But before Harrison could sputter out another fabrication, before he could spin another grand tale of misunderstood genius and banking glitches, a sharp, grating screech echoed through the hall. It was the sound of a chair being pushed back deliberately across the parquetry floor. At the VIP table, the man in the charcoal suit stood up. He didn't rush, and he didn't look angry. He buttoned his jacket with a slow, methodical elegance that was far more terrifying than any shouting. Adjusting his tinted lenses, he picked up his glass of club soda and walked directly toward the stage. The crowd instinctively backed away from him. He possessed an aura, a gravitational field of sheer authority that made local politicians and executives step aside. He walked up the steps to the head table, his heavy boots resonating perfectly with the pounding of 500 anxious hearts. He stopped right beside me, looking down at the police report I had placed on the table. He gave a single slow nod, a gesture of professional respect. "You're missing a page, Arthur," he said. His voice was deep, gravelly, and projected effortlessly across the room without the aid of a microphone. "But for a preliminary assessment, this is completely accurate." He reached into his internal pocket and pulled out a thick manila envelope, tossing it onto the table right next to my paperwork. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. Harrison, or Howard, as his true records indicated, winced, as if he had been physically struck. "Who is this?" Eleanor shrieked, her voice high-pitched and bordering on complete hysteria. She looked back and forth between me and the stranger, her eyes wild with confusion. "Is he a business partner? Is he the banker? Harrison, tell them who he is." Harrison couldn't speak. He was hyperventilating, shaking his head frantically at the stranger, begging with his eyes, a silent plea to stop, to remain silent. The stranger completely ignored him. He turned toward Eleanor, removing his glasses to reveal the cold, piercing gray eyes that had analyzed me at the bar. "I am not a banker, ma'am," he said clearly. "My name is Investigator Miller. I am a licensed private investigator out of the state of Texas, and I am currently retained by Mrs. Sarah Fisk." Eleanor blinked, a tear tracing a path down her chin. "Who? Who is Sarah Fisk?" The stranger smiled, but it was entirely devoid of warmth. It was the grin of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey. "She is the woman who has been married to this man for 15 years, he said, pointing a finger directly at Harrison. "She is the mother of his 3 children in Houston, and she is the woman he entirely drained of her life savings 6 months ago before vanishing to find a new target." A collective gasp ripped through the pavilion, a physical sound like all the oxygen being simultaneously vacuumed out of the ballroom. "Married?" someone whispered. "3 kids," another muttered. Eleanor grabbed the edge of the table to steady herself. Her knees buckled completely, and she collapsed back into her chair, her white gown deflating around her like a punctured parachute. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "That's impossible. We just got married. I signed the documents. There's a valid marriage license." "The license is completely void," the investigator said, his voice cutting through her denial like a scalpel. "You cannot legally marry a man who is already wed. This entire ceremony was a fraud. The vows are null. Frankly, considering he used a fraudulent alias on the application, I doubt those papers will even make it past the county clerk's wastebasket." He turned his gray eyes back onto Harrison. "Hello, Howard," he said softly. "It's been a long chase. You're an incredibly difficult man to pin down. You change identities the way most men change their socks. Harrison Vance, Arthur Wayne, Marcus Gold, you certainly possess a vivid imagination." Harrison finally found his voice, letting out a high-pitched, strangled shriek. "This is absolute defamation!" he screamed, backing up until he crashed into the DJ booth. "I don't know this person. He's an actor. Arthur hired him. This is a complete setup." The investigator let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "A setup?" he countered. He reached down, grabbed the heavy envelope he had thrown onto the table, and tore it completely open. Photographs spilled out across the silk, dozens of them. "Here you are in Miami, selling non-existent resort properties to retirees. Truly G-Go," the investigator narrated, tossing a photo into the crowd. "Here you are in Dallas, operating a fraudulent charity scam for veterans. And here you are just last week in New York, meeting with a hard money lending syndicate because your scheme was running completely dry." He looked out at the audience, addressing the 500 guests who were now standing, recording the entire spectacle on their phones, witnessing the total dismantling of a social climber. "Here's the raw data, folks," the investigator announced. "A classic fraudulent structure. He used the capital from his new bride to cover the debts of his past life. That Costa Rican eco-resort he promised a 300% return on? There is no resort. There is no infrastructure. There is only a shell account in the Cayman Islands that he used to finance his custom suits and his rented Maybach. Julian stepped forward, looking like an absolute ghost, his face a dull shade of ash. He reached down and picked up one of the stray photographs. It showed Harrison standing outside a fast food restaurant, wearing a faded uniform. The timestamp was from merely 2 years prior. You worked a fry station? Julian whispered, his voice cracking with a terrifying realization. Harrison aggressively snatched the photo away. I was performing corporate due diligence for a franchise investment portfolio. But Julian wasn't listening anymore. Reality was crushing him under its immense weight. The stock options, the vice president title, the millions of dollars. It was all smoke. Where is the trust fund? Julian asked, his voice shaking with pure rage. The document I signed tonight. Where is it? Harrison's eyes darted wildly. It's secure. It's actively being processed. It's gone, the investigator corrected smoothly. Or rather, it would be gone if your father hadn't been intelligent enough to lock it down with a restrictive covenant. But the rest of it, the brownstone refinance capital, the savings, the alimony, he turned his focus to Eleanor. Mrs. Pendleton, I am deeply sorry to inform you that 3 hours ago, he wired your entire $1.5 million to an offshore sports betting website. He attempted to double the capital on a soccer match in Brazil. I looked up, meeting the investigator's gaze. It was the first time I had spoken since he stepped onto the stage. Did he win? I asked. The investigator looked at me and slowly shook his head. He bet on the underdog, Arthur. He lost absolutely everything. Eleanor let out a sound that didn't even sound human. It was the raw, guttural cry of a wounded animal. She lunged entirely across the head table, colliding directly with the grand wedding cake. The massive 5-tier structure fell hard to the floor, exploding into a chaotic disaster of fondant and buttercream. She frantically clawed at Harrison's face, screaming a barrage of frantic, desperate curses. You thief! You absolute monster! My house! My entire life! Harrison shoved her away, pushing her hard enough that she stumbled back into the heap of ruined cake on the floor. The pleasantries were finished. The facade was entirely over. His eyes darted toward the side door, where the emergency exit sign cast a dull red glow through the ambient light. Everyone back off! Harrison shouted, thrusting his hand deep inside his jacket. For a split second, a wave of panic swept the room as guests scrambled beneath the tables. But he didn't pull a weapon. He snatched a passport from his pocket. He leaped from the stage, landing awkwardly and twisting his ankle, but the pure adrenaline kept him moving. Scrambling to his feet, he charged straight for the side doors leading toward the kitchen and the loading docks. Stop him! Julian yelled, but he was completely paralyzed by the shock. Harrison crashed directly into a server carrying a heavy tray of champagne, sending glass shattering across the room. He shoved past Great-Aunt Martha, who swung her purse blindly at his head, and missed. He was running completely for his survival. He reached the heavy double doors, throwing his entire weight against them, expecting them to burst open into the night. But they didn't budge. He pushed again, slamming his shoulder into the solid wood. They were completely locked. He spun around, total panic etched into every single line of his sweat-streaked face, and began sprinting back toward the main entrance. But right as he reached the center of the room, the main foyer doors burst open. They didn't open for his escape. They swung wide as 4 uniformed police officers strode into the pavilion, flanked closely by the 2 massive security guards I'd seen earlier. Harrison slammed on the brakes, completely trapped. Behind him was a room full of furious guests. Ahead of him was the absolute reality of the law. He looked left, then right, and finally his eyes locked onto me. I remained standing calmly by the head table, right next to the wreckage of the cake and his sobbing, fraudulent bride. I raised my water glass slightly in his direction. Checkmate, Howard, I said softly. The officers closed the distance instantly. Harrison attempted to duck away, but one of the guards, built like a commercial refrigerator, grabbed the back of his sweat-stained white tuxedo jacket. He hoisted Harrison completely off his feet and brought him down hard against a table, sending silverware scattering in every direction. I have immunity! Harrison shrieked, his face pressed flat against a plate of untouched greens. I'm a sovereign citizen. You're a con man with an outstanding warrant, the lead officer replied calmly, clicking a pair of heavy steel handcuffs tightly around his wrists. You have the right to remain silent. Though frankly, I'd encourage you to keep talking, because everything you say is making this case incredibly easy to close. The ballroom descended into absolute chaos. Camera flashes strode across the room as guests shouted, wept, and demanded explanations. Clara was actively screaming at a nearby deputy, desperately claiming she had no association with him and was a victim herself. Julian sat flat on the floor, staring blankly at the ceiling in a state of total shock. And Eleanor sat right in the middle of the ruined wedding cake, white frosting smeared across her face like theatrical makeup, holding her head in her hands and weeping uncontrollably. The investigator walked back over to my table, sliding his tinted lenses back into place. My client in Florida is going to be incredibly satisfied, he noted. Obviously, the capital is permanently gone. It's evaporated, but at least she gets to see him trade that white tuxedo for a state-issued uniform. He looked out over the sweeping landscape of total destruction. You know, Arthur, he remarked, most people would have stepped in a lot sooner. They would have tried to stop the wire before the capital moved. Why exactly did you wait? I looked at my ex-wife, then at the son who had threatened to declare me incompetent just hours prior. Because, investigator, I replied calmly, if I had stopped this yesterday, they would have spent the rest of their lives harboring resentment toward me for destroying their dream. They would have labeled me bitter. They would have blamed me for the millions they supposedly lost. They had to physically witness the check bounce with their own eyes. I adjusted the lapels of my charcoal suit jacket. Sometimes, the absolute only way to resolve a massive short circuit in a system is to let the entire structure burn to the ground. Only then can you safely begin to clear the debris and rebuild the foundation from scratch. The officers marched Harrison out of the hall. He was openly weeping now, begging Eleanor to contact a legal team, imploring Julian to secure a bond. But no one moved a muscle. No one uttered a sound. The celebration was finished. The marriage was a total fabrication. The vast fortune was a complete myth. And I, the man they had dismissed as a relic of the past, was the only structure left, standing perfectly upright in the middle of the ruins. He ran down the stage steps, throwing his entire body directly between the police and Harrison. Spreading his arms wide to block their path, he looked completely absurd, a boy in a tight tuxedo attempting to halt a speeding freight train. "You're making a massive mistake," Julian shouted at the officers. "This man is a billionaire. He owns Vance Capital. He's about to launch a green infrastructure development that will change the world." "Julian, shut up," Harrison hissed under his breath, violently twisting to break free from the deputy's grip. "No!" Julian pressed on, his voice cracking as it rose in volume. "I've reviewed the charts. I saw the Costa Rican master plans on his laptop. This is a complete setup. You're trying to sabotage him because he's systematically disrupting the entire real estate industry." The lead officer stopped. He looked down at Julian with an expression that was a mix of intense irritation and pity. He was a large man, looking thoroughly exhausted from working a long shift, and he clearly possessed zero patience for someone else's delusions. "Son, step aside," the officer said calmly. "I won't!" Julian shrieked. He lunged forward, grabbing Harrison's arm to pull him away from the law. "Let him go! He has a live video conference with Tokyo in an hour. He is my primary business partner." The officer's patience dissolved entirely. He didn't draw a weapon, and he didn't raise his voice. He simply extended a single, heavy arm and delivered a firm shove. It wasn't an act of violence, but it was absolute and definitive. Julian stumbled backward, tripping over his own expensive dress shoes, and hit the parquetry floor hard. He landed right beside his mother. "Stay down," the officer growled, pointing a thick finger directly into Julian's face. "Unless you want to share a cell with him. We are executing a felony warrant for Howard Fisk. If you continue to obstruct justice, we will process you as an accessory to the crime. Do you want a federal charge on your record for harboring a known fugitive?" Julian blinked, staring blankly up at the deputy. The word accessory seemed to hang heavily in the air. But But I'm the vice president, Julian whispered, his voice trembling. You're the vice president of a ghost corporation, the officer said bluntly. There is no company. There is no land. There is only a laptop loaded with Photoshop files and a list of defrauded victims. Now sit there and keep your mouth shut, or I'm putting you in cuffs too. Julian turned his head toward Harrison, searching for the confident billionaire who had promised him the world. Harrison wouldn't even meet his gaze. He kept his eyes locked on the floor, muttering under his breath about securing bail. Julian looked out at the guests. 500 people were staring right back at him. The envy that had filled their eyes during his speech was entirely gone, replaced by a wave of profound disgust. The whispers washed over the stage. That's his stepson. He was involved in the scam. He just delivered that speech defending him. The illusion was entirely shattered. I watched the light leave my son's eyes as the fragile identity he had constructed collapsed under the immense weight of reality. He wasn't a titan of finance. He was an absolute fool. A 32-year-old man sitting in a pile of ruined cake, defending a thief who had systematically liquidated his mother's future. The officers began marching Harrison toward the exit. The crowd parted effortlessly, hoisting their phones to record every single second of the walk of shame. The flashes strode across the dark room like strobe lights. Harrison attempted to hold his chin up, but the sheer weight of the steel handcuffs pulled his shoulders down. As he passed my position, he paused for a fraction of a second. "Arthur," he whispered frantically, sweat dripping from his chin. "That offshore venture, it's a guaranteed return." "Keep moving, Chief," the deputy said, shoving him forward through the doors. I watched them vanish, the flashing blue lights of the patrol cars reflecting sharply against the glass facade of the entrance. In the center of the room, my former family remained pinned to the floor. Eleanor rocked back and forth rhythmically, clutching a stained silk tablecloth, muttering the same figure over and over. 1.5 million, 1.5 million. Julian stared down at his own palms as if they were covered in blood. Clara, who had been hiding safely near the chocolate fountain throughout the entire arrest, finally stepped forward. She looked down at Julian sitting on the floor. She didn't extend a hand to help him up, and she didn't ask if he was unharmed. Instead, she snatched off her engagement ring, the one Julian was still paying off on his credit card installments, and threw it directly into his lap. "You absolute idiot!" she hissed, her voice sharp and vicious. "You swore to me he was the real deal. You told me we were about to be multi-millionaires." She spun on her heel, her stilettos clacking sharply against the wood as she strode away, abandoning my son in the middle of the wreckage he had actively helped construct. I stood there for a final moment. The climate control units kicked back in, blowing a stream of cold air across the stunned, sweating audience. The scent of stale perfume and raw panic was suffocating. I adjusted my cuffs, checking my jacket pocket to ensure my passport and return ticket were perfectly secure. I walked over to where Julian sat, stopping right above him. I cast a long shadow over his form, much like the shadow he had claimed to live under for decades, with nothing but resentment and blindness. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot, wet, and completely vacant. "Dad," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't know." I looked down at him. I felt no anger, and I felt no petty triumph. I felt only the cold, hard clarity that comes when a financial balance sheet finally resolves to zero. "You didn't want to know, Julian," I said. "That is the material difference." I turned my back on them and walked toward the exit. There was absolutely nothing left to repair in this room. The power was disconnected, the wiring was completely fried, and the structure had been condemned. It was time to head back to Bar Harbor, where the lights were stable and the people were real. There's a highly specific kind of sleep that belongs exclusively to a man who has fully settled his accounts. It is a deep, heavy, dreamless state. It's the rest of a structural engineer who knows that every single bolt has been torqued to specification and every live wire has been thoroughly insulated. For the first time in months, I wasn't sleeping in a house that felt like a museum dedicated to my own failures. I slept in a premium hotel bed with crisp linen, paid for entirely with my own independent capital, in a city where the truth had finally cleared the air. The digital display on the nightstand read 2:14 a.m. when the phone began to thud against the wood. It wasn't a soft ringtone. In the absolute quiet of the luxury suite, it resonated like a fire alarm. I didn't jump, and I didn't panic. I slowly rolled over, my joints cracking slightly in the cool air conditioning. Extending a hand calloused from 40 years of handling iron and drafting blueprints, I flipped the device over. The screen was blindingly bright in the darkness. Flashing across the display was a name I had considered blocking a dozen times. Eleanor. I stared at it as the device vibrated angrily against the nightstand, a persistent, demanding buzz. A part of me, the young man who had met her at a university dance back in 1979, wanted to ignore it entirely. I wanted to flip the phone face down and return to that quiet, unburdened sleep. But the engineer in me was trained to investigate alarms. You don't ignore a warning light simply because you dislike the data it's presenting. I slid the green icon across the screen. I didn't offer a greeting. I simply pressed the phone to my ear and waited. For the first 10 seconds, there were no words, only raw audio, the sound of heavy wind whipping against a microphone, the distant wail of a police siren, and a breath so ragged and wet it sounded like a compromised lung. Arthur. Her voice was a mere ghost of the one that had screamed insults at me across restaurants. It was thin, brittle, and entirely broken. It was the sound of a child who had dropped their ice cream into the dirt. Arthur, are you there? Please, tell me you're there. I sat up, swinging my legs over the edge of the bed and planting my feet firmly onto the carpet. I reached for the water bottle sitting on the table. I'm here, Eleanor, I said. My voice was deep, laced with sleep, but perfectly steady. Oh, thank God. Thank God. Arthur, you have to help me. You have to come get me right now. I took a slow sip of water. Where exactly are you? I'm sitting on the curb outside the estate gates. They threw us out, Arthur. They physically removed us from the property. The moment the police escorted Harrison away, the general manager informed us. We had exactly 30 minutes to vacate the premises. 30 minutes? I couldn't even pack everything. I left my shoes behind. I left my cosmetics. She paused to let out a loud, ugly sob that heavily distorted the audio. And then they affixed seals to the main doors. Bright red stickers, Arthur. They said the bridal suite is an active crime scene because Harrison concealed forged financial instruments inside. I have nowhere to go. I attempted to call a transport service using my accounts, but everything was declined. The bank has frozen absolutely every asset due to the investigation. I listened quietly, looking out the hotel window toward the Hamptons coastline. The lights of the nearby mansions continued to flicker in the distance, completely indifferent to the ruin of the former Mrs. Vance. Where's Julian? I asked. He's sitting right next to me on his suitcase. He won't speak a word. Arthur, it's bad. It's incredibly bad. The deputies informed Julian that he's a primary person of interest in the fraud case because he signed his name as a guarantor on those hard money bridge loans, because he was officially listed as the vice president of operations. They seized his passport, Arthur. They took it right out of his hands in the lobby. The panic surged in her throat, and she began to weep hysterically. They're going to arrest our son, Arthur. The manager claims Julian is personally liable for the catering debt and the yacht charter. He doesn't possess that kind of capital. He's going to prison. You cannot let this happen. He is your own flesh and blood, Arthur. He is your only son. I closed my eyes. I remembered Julian standing at the altar, pronouncing Harrison as his true father figure. I remembered Julian attempting to bully me into signing away the 529 educational fund. I remembered my son telling me I was a mediocre relic of the past. He's an adult, Eleanor, I said. He wanted to be a player in the world of big business. This is just business. No, don't be so heartless. This is not the time for a lecture. She gasped for air, the heavy wind howling on her end of the line. It had to be barely 40 degrees outside, and she was likely still shivering in that ridiculous, ruined wedding dress. Arthur, listen to me. I made a mistake, okay? I admit it. I was foolish. I got swept up in the glamour. But I am still your wife. In the eyes of God, I am still your wife. That ceremony was completely fraudulent, and that man is a criminal, which means we are still us. We are still Arthur and Eleanor. I tightened my grip on the device. The sheer, unadulterated nerve of this woman was breathtaking. It was a total structural collapse of basic morality, and I almost felt a microscopic ounce of awe for it. "There is no us, Eleanor," I said, my delivery perfectly even. "There hasn't been an us in a very long time. But we have a history. 40 years of history, Arthur. You can't just discard all of that because of one catastrophic year. I know you. I know your heart. You are a provider. You fix things. That's what you do. You repair broken structures. I am broken, Arthur. Your family is entirely broken. Please, I know you have capital now. I heard what you said in the ballroom. $12 million in licensing fees. That is an immense fortune. It's more than enough to fix this disaster." Her tone dropped into a low register, attempting to rediscover that intimate, familiar frequency she used to employ whenever she wanted me to finance a new vehicle or clear the balance on an extravagant vacation we couldn't afford. "You can settle the catering bill with the hotel," she bargained. "You can retain a top-tier legal team for Julian. You can book a luxury suite for me. We can sit down and talk. We can rebuild. I'll sign whatever paperwork you want. I'll even relocate to Maine with you. I've always wanted to see the autumn leaves up there." I let her speak, allowing the silence to stretch long after she stopped. I glanced at the clock. It was 2:20 a.m. She had been pitching her terms for 6 continuous minutes. She was bargaining, offering her return to my life as if it were a grand prize, fully operating under the assumption that I was still the same man who desperately sought her validation, the man who felt incredibly lucky just to occupy a space in her orbit. She genuinely believed my dignity possessed a price tag, and that the tag read $12 million. "Arthur, why aren't you saying anything? Speak to me. Please tell me you're on your way here. Tell me you still love me. I know you do. A love like ours doesn't just evaporate." "You're right about one thing, Eleanor," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room. "Love doesn't just evaporate. It gets systematically destroyed. It gets beaten down by endless insults, starved by utter neglect, and stabbed through the heart by betrayal. And finally, it gets permanently buried beneath a mountain of insatiable greed." I took a deep breath, feeling an incredible, unfamiliar lightness in my chest. The very final ounce of pressure had dissipated. "Eleanor," I said, I'm here, sweetheart. I want you to listen to me with absolute clarity." "I'm listening. Your phone is currently functional. That's excellent. You need to conserve that battery life." "What?" "You're reaching out to the wrong entity, Eleanor. I am not your husband. I am not your savior. And I am certainly not your private banking institution. I am merely a bystander." "Arthur, please don't do this." "The number you need to dial right now isn't mine," I continued, my delivery as cold and final as a main circuit breaker snapping shut. "You need to look up the contact information for the New York Legal Aid Society." A shocking, breathless silence filled the line. "What?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Legal aid? But that's for indigent people." "I'm fully aware," I replied, and then I performed the single most merciful action available to me. I terminated the call. I didn't slam the phone down. I simply pressed the red icon. The line went completely dead. The sobbing, the howling wind, the desperate manipulation, it all vanished into the ether. I placed the device face down on the nightstand and sat in the absolute stillness of the hotel suite. I poured myself a final glass of water and drank it down slowly. I thought about Julian sitting out there on his suitcase. I thought about Eleanor shivering in the biting autumn air. I felt a wave of basic human pity. Yes, I am a human being, but pity is not an obligation. I had granted them every single opportunity to change course. I had explicitly warned them. For decades, I had done everything within my power to be a dedicated father and a faithful husband. They made their independent calculations. They selected the fast track, the effortless capital, and the polished exterior. Now they were learning a fundamental truth of mechanics. When you construct your home on a foundation of sand, you don't possess the right to call for a carpenter when the high tide rolls in. I lay back down, pulling the duvet right up to my chin. The sheets were crisp, cool, and smooth. I closed my eyes. Tomorrow I would board my flight back to Maine, buy a fresh baguette from the baker, and sit on the Atlantic rocks to watch the ocean. And I would never, under any circumstances, answer that frequency again. Within minutes, I was sound asleep. The morning sun streamed through the massive glass atrium of the hotel lobby, bright, relentless, and perfectly clear. It was exactly the kind of light I preferred. I had completed my checkout process 10 minutes ahead of schedule. My account was entirely settled, and my luggage was packed with military precision, a habit forged from half a century of organizing gear in toolboxes. Wearing a comfortable traveling sweater and my reading glasses, I looked precisely like the unassuming retired grandfather I was. I felt incredibly unburdened, as if a massive physical load had been lifted from my shoulders. The toxic energy of the previous night had been thoroughly washed away by a hot shower and 8 hours of uninterrupted rest. Pulling my suitcase behind me, I navigated toward the revolving doors to catch the airport shuttle to JFK. My mind was already back in Bar Harbor, tasting the crisp salt air and anticipating a fresh lobster dinner. But as I rounded the massive potted palm tree near the concierge desk, my path was entirely blocked. It wasn't a physical structural barrier, but the effect was identical. Standing there looking exactly like the survivors of a severe maritime disaster were Clara and Julian. They bore absolutely zero resemblance to the arrogant power couple who had mocked my tailoring less than 24 hours ago. Julian was still wearing his tuxedo trousers from the ceremony, but his dress shirt was completely unbuttoned and stained with a dark purple liquid that looked suspiciously like red wine. What's more, he was entirely shoeless, standing in a pair of flimsy hotel slippers. Clara, the digital influencer who never permitted a single image to exist without a dozen filters, looked completely unraveled. Her hair was pulled into a chaotic bird's nest bun. Her face was completely devoid of cosmetics, exposing heavy dark circles beneath her eyes, and she wore an expression of manic, frantic desperation. It was the exact look a client gets when they realize they've severed the primary electrical feed and the sparks are starting to fly. "Arthur!" Clara shrieked. Before I could even halt my stride, she lunged directly toward me, grabbing my arms with a surprising, desperate force. "Dad! Oh, thank God we intercepted you. Please don't leave. You can't leave us." I stopped pulling my suitcase. Looking down at her hands gripping the fabric of my sweater, I gently but firmly pried her fingers off my arm, one by one. I have a flight to catch, Clara," I said. My voice was perfectly flat and calm, the exact tone I used to employ when informing a client that their primary load-bearing wall had suffered a catastrophic failure. "No, you don't understand," she sobbed, tears instantly welling up and spilling over her cheeks, in a display of pure panic. "We are so incredibly sorry, Dad. We were so blind. That monster Harrison, he completely brainwashed us. He made us believe in things that weren't real." She turned her frantic gaze toward Julian, who was standing a few feet away, staring intently at the lobby carpet like a condemned inmate awaiting sentencing. "Tell him, Julian," Clara screamed, her voice cracking. "Tell your father how sorry we are." Julian slowly raised his head. His eyes were heavily swollen and bloodshot. As he looked at me, I recognized the shame. Yes, but I also recognized the exact same weakness that had engineered his downfall in the first place. He was still desperately scanning the environment, looking for a provider to shoulder his weight. "I'm sorry, Dad," Julian mumbled, his voice hollow. "I completely blew it." "You didn't just blow it, son," I replied. "You systematically dismantled your own future. There is a profound structural difference." Clara stepped directly between us, attempting to seize control of the narrative once more. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand, trying to project a fragile, vulnerable persona. "We know, Dad. We know. But we can fix this. We're a family, right? Families forgive each other. Families rebuild. But we are in a massive amount of trouble right now, an incredible amount." I waited patiently. I knew the invoice was about to be presented. It always was. "They evicted us from the estate grounds," Clara whispered, dropping her tone to a frantic murmur. "And the federal authorities, they just seized the Boston brownstone. They claimed the entire property and the secondary financing are hard-coded into the fraud trail. We have nowhere to go, Arthur. Literally nowhere. Eleanor is currently at a processing shelter downtown, and Julian and I spent the night sleeping on the lobby sofas until the building security forced us awake. I looked down at my watch. The shuttle arrives in 10 minutes. What's your point, Clara? Clara took a sharp breath, placing her hand over her stomach. It was an exaggerated theatrical gesture I'd seen in 100 bad daytime soap operas. I wasn't planning on telling you this way, she said, looking up at me through her eyelashes, but I'm pregnant. I didn't blink, and I didn't gasp. I looked down at her stomach, which was as flat as a drafting board. Pregnant? I repeated. Yes, she said, nodding desperately. 6 weeks. We just found out right before the ceremony. That's why we were so desperate, Dad. That's why Julian trusted Harrison. We were trying to build a future for your grandchild, the next generation of the Pendleton family. She reached out to grab my hand again, trying to press it against her stomach. You're going to be a grandfather, Arthur. A grandpa. Don't you want your grandchild to have a home? Don't you want him to grow up in the very house his grandfather personally reinforced? I pulled my hand back. The manipulation was so clumsy it was practically an insult to my intelligence. So what we need you to do, Clara rushed on, thinking she'd successfully hooked me, we need you to buy the brownstone back, or clear the debt for us. If you just step in with your cash, with the money from your patents, we could all live there together. You, me, Julian, the baby. We can be a real family again. She forced a trembling, hopeful smile. Please, Dad, for the baby. I looked over at Julian. He was nodding along, clutching desperately to the literal lifeline his wife had just inflated for him. Yeah, Dad, Julian whimpered. For the baby. I took a step back, looking at the two of them, then at the marble floor and the glittering chandelier above. I switched completely into engineering mode. I stripped away the emotion, the tears, and the word grandfather. I looked strictly at the raw data. Clara, I began, you say you're pregnant? Yes. And you say you're 6 weeks along? Yes. Fascinating, I said, because at the rehearsal dinner 2 nights ago, I watched you drink 4 glasses of champagne, and at the penthouse party, you were taking shots of tequila with the bridesmaids. Now, either you are the most irresponsible mother in history, or you are lying to an old man to gain access to his wallet. Clara's face went entirely pale. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. But for the sake of the argument, let's assume you're telling the truth, I continued, my voice hardening. Let's assume there really is a child, and you want me to buy back the house. Yes, she whispered. Let's analyze the data, I said, lifting my hand and counting on my fingers. The property was appraised at $1.5 million. Eleanor extracted $1.5 million via a high-interest equity line. That capital is gone, stolen. If I buy the house back, I am not purchasing an asset. I am acquiring a liability. I would have to clear the bank's liens just to secure the title. I took a step closer to them. I'm a math man, Clara. I understand investments. Why would I spend $1.5 million to purchase a structure, only to inherit an additional $1.5 million in debt? The financial architecture of that deal is completely collapsed. But it's your home, Clara argued, her voice rising. It has emotional value. Emotional value doesn't pay the electric bill, I snapped, and it certainly doesn't cover the cost of terrible decisions. I turned my focus to Julian. You want a house? I asked him. Get a job, rent an apartment, build your foundation from the ground up, the way every man has to do when he falls. But we can't, Clara wailed, the fake sweetness entirely evaporating into raw panic. Our credit is destroyed. Julian's score is completely obliterated because of those co-signatures. We don't even have the cash for a security deposit. Then go to a shelter, I said. A shelter? Clara gasped. Like homeless people? Yes, I replied, with people who are actually facing reality, unlike you. I grabbed the handle of my suitcase. You are monstrous, Clara screamed, finally tearing off the mask completely. You are a bitter, selfish old man. You have millions. You could solve this with a single signature. You're hoarding your wealth while you watch your family suffer. I halted my stride, turning to face them one last time. I am not hoarding it, I said. I am protecting it. I am shielding it from people who believe that tears are a form of currency. I am a structural engineer, Clara. I calculate based on structural integrity and load capacities. Right now, the two of you are a collapsed bridge. I'm not driving my truck onto it just because you ask politely. I looked down at her stomach. If there really is a baby, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, may God help that child. Because if his parents believe that lying and begging constitute a career path, he has absolutely no chance. I turned around. The automated doors hissed open. The crisp New York air hit my face, and it tasted exactly like freedom. I didn't look back. I could hear Clara screaming insults behind me, and I could hear Julian sobbing. But it was just noise. It was merely the sound of a machine malfunctioning because the operators failed to read the manual. I stepped out to the curb. The airport shuttle was already waiting. The driver, a man around my own age, stepped out to take my bag. "Ready to head home, sir?" he asked. I looked up at the gray sky, closed my eyes, and pictured the red autumn leaves and the ocean rocks of Maine. "Yes," I said, "I'm ready to go home, and this time I'm not leaving a forwarding address." "You're just a bitter old man," Julian screamed, his voice cracking under the weight of his own utter insignificance. He lunged away from Clara, pointing a trembling finger directly at my chest. "You're enjoying this, aren't you? You love watching us beg," he roared, desperate to land a blow. "But who even are you, Dad? You're just a retired blue-collar engineer. You live on a pension. You clip coupons. You drive a beat-up car you fix yourself. You act like you're some big shot who could rescue us. But we know the truth. You don't have the money to buy back that house, even if you wanted to. That whole story about patents and being a millionaire, you're just bluffing to hurt us." The accusation cut through the crisp morning air. The shuttle driver stopped loading my bags, turning to look at us. He took in Julian's unbuttoned tuxedo shirt and flimsy hotel slippers, then looked at me in my traveling sweater and reading glasses. He didn't say a word, but I saw the evaluation in his eyes. He saw a respectable gentleman being harassed by an unhinged stranger. I could have walked away right then. I could have stepped onto the bus and let Julian live out the rest of his days in his delusions. That would have been the noble path. But I wasn't feeling particularly noble today. I was a man who had been completely erased by his own family for 40 years. I was the man who had been told he thought too small, the man dismissed as a failure because he didn't drive a Maybach. Sometimes when people spend decades telling you that you are nothing, you have to show them exactly what structural integrity looks like. I gestured to the driver to give me a moment, then turned back to face my son. "You think I'm broke, Julian?" I asked softly. "You think my refusal is born out of inability rather than a calculated choice?" Julian let out a wet, hysterical laugh. "Of course you're broke. Mom took 60%. You live in that isolated Maine fishing village because it's cheap. You're a financial refugee, Dad. Stop pretending." I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. I didn't pull out a wallet. I extracted a slim, genuine leather card case, slid out a card, and held it out. It wasn't my business card. It was a heavy, cream-colored card with raised black lettering. Julian didn't want to take it, but his curiosity was a reflex he couldn't control. He snatched it out of my hand. "Read it," I said. "Read the name of the corporation." Julian squinted at the card. "Mitsui Infrastructure and Energy Group," he read aloud. "Tokyo. So what? You know a representative at a Japanese firm. Congratulations. Turn it over," I instructed. He flipped the card. On the back, written in precise blue ink, was a string of alphanumeric characters. "What is this?" Julian asked. "A tracking number?" "That is an international wire transfer confirmation code," I said, "and the date stamp right next to it is from yesterday afternoon." I took a deliberate step closer, forcing him to look me dead in the eye. "You're right about one thing, Julian. I am a retired structural engineer. But you completely forgot what kind of engineering I specialize in. I don't just tighten bolts on bridges. I design seismic protection. 10 years ago, I patented an intelligent base isolation system capable of shifting a skyscraper's mass to absorb devastating lateral forces during an earthquake. For a long time, the market wasn't ready for it. It was too advanced, too expensive to implement. I paused, letting the data settle in, but the world caught up. New high-efficiency green developments require that exact structural protection. The executives from Mitsui have been visiting my cabin in Maine for 6 months. We have been meticulously negotiating the terms. And yesterday, while you were offering toast to a con man and your mother was marrying a felon, I was finalizing the technology transfer via secure video conference with their board of directors. Clara stopped crying entirely. She stared at me, her mouth slightly open as the gears in her mind instantly shifted from manipulation to frantic calculation. What exactly does that mean? She whispered. It means I sold the core licensing rights for the Asian and North American markets, I said. For how much? Julian asked, his voice reduced to a thin whisper. He stared at the card again, as if the numbers would physically manifest on the paper. I looked over at the shuttle. The heavy diesel engine was idling, a low, powerful rumble vibrating through the pavement. The final settlement was $12 million, I said. The silence that followed wasn't like the shock in the ballroom. This silence was absolute death. It was the sound of an entire universe collapsing. 12 million, Julian repeated mechanically. Cash, I clarified. A lump sum advance. No stock options, no digital tokens, no promises of future returns. $12 million, cleared and deposited into my Swiss account yesterday afternoon. I let a cold smile touch my lips as I delivered the final metric. And here is the most elegant part of the design, son. The divorce was finalized 6 months ago. The division of assets is legally closed. Your mother's legal team was incredibly thorough. They took the Back Bay brownstone and they drained the joint cash reserves. But they never thought to audit a dormant, unmonitored piece of intellectual property. I leaned in slightly toward Julian. It belongs entirely to me, son. Every single cent. It is post-divorce income. Eleanor isn't entitled to a fraction of a penny, and neither are you. A voice cut through from behind them. A dull, sickening thud. We all turned our heads around in unison. There stood Eleanor. She must have walked out of the hotel's revolving doors right when I started detailing the transaction. She was wearing a gray fleece tracksuit, the telltale style of a hotel lost and found bin. She looked 10 years older than she had yesterday. Her complexion was completely gray and her eyes were entirely vacant. She had heard it. She had heard the raw data of that figure. 12 million, she whispered. She stared right at me. She stared at the man she had discarded like garbage, the man she had traded away for a collection of elaborate lies. Arthur, she spoke, her voice a fragile mix of a prayer and total horror. 12 million, and then her eyes rolled completely back. She didn't faint elegantly like actresses do in films. She dropped straight down like a stone, hitting the solid marble floor of the entrance with a sickening, wet impact of flesh against stone. Mom! Julian shrieked. He and Clara lunged toward her form, kneeling right in the frosting and debris, frantically slapping her cheeks to force her awake. Mom, wake up! Clara shouted. Then her eyes snapped up to meet mine. They were filled with an entirely new species of panic, the panic of a person who suddenly realizes they have systematically incinerated the single remaining bridge to salvation. Dad, help us! Clara screamed, her voice piercing the lobby. She might be having a heart attack. You have to authorize payment for an ambulance. We have no medical coverage. I looked down at my ex-wife lying flat on the floor. I looked at the woman who had demanded a lifestyle she hadn't earned, paying the ultimate structural price for the calculation error. I looked at my son and his wife, who were now staring up at me not as a father, but as a $12 million automated teller machine. I felt zero petty triumph. I felt no joy. I felt only a profound sense of validation. The mathematics had finally resolved. The ledger was perfectly balanced. I turned my back on them and faced the shuttle driver. I am ready to depart now, I said. But sir, the driver stammered, pointing a finger toward the scene on the marble. Don't you want to step in and... I placed a steady hand on his shoulder. That isn't my family, I said smoothly. That is merely a cautionary tale. I stepped aboard the bus. The doors hissed shut with a mechanical snap, sealing me inside the warm, absolute quiet of the cabin. I navigated to a window seat, looking down one final time as the vehicle pulled away from the curb. I watched the hotel's security staff rush out to administer aid to Eleanor. I watched Julian sit flat on the pavement, holding his head in his hands, rocking back and forth rhythmically. I saw Clara run a few desperate paces after the moving shuttle, screaming words through the glass that I couldn't hear, before giving up entirely and collapsing onto the concrete. I leaned back comfortably into the seat, pulled out my device, and opened my banking application. I stared at the balance, a long, elegant string of digits. It looked abstract, but it looked exactly like freedom. I closed the app. I didn't need to monitor it. I knew the foundation was solid. I watched the New York streets slide past the window, the gray architecture, the cold wind, the remnants of 40 years of relentless labor and thankless sacrifice. "Goodbye," I whispered into the glass. The shuttle pulled up cleanly in front of the terminal, but the engine didn't immediately wind down. The driver hesitated, his foot hovering over the brake pedal, because a frantic, erratic pounding began vibrating against the glass doors. It was a desperate, rhythmic thrashing, sounding exactly like a bird repeatedly flying headfirst into a window pane, completely unable to comprehend the nature of the barrier. I looked down. It was Julian. He had detached himself from his unconscious mother and broken away from his hysterical wife, sprinting alongside the moving bus. His hands were slapping wildly against the metal frame, his face pressed flat against the glass. His tuxedo shirt was completely shredded, and he had lost one of his hotel slippers, leaving him to hop frantically on one sock across the freezing, dirty asphalt of the airport terminal. "Open the door!" he shrieked, his voice muffled by the insulation. "Dad, please open the door." The driver looked back at me through the rearview mirror, his eyes posing a silent question. Do we proceed, or do we yield? I could have offered a simple nod. I could have instructed him to accelerate, which would have been the easiest escape route. But I am a man who finishes a job. Even when you are abandoning a compromised structure, you don't leave a live, exposed wire hanging. You cap it off to make the perimeter safe. "Open it," I told the driver, "just for a minute." The air brakes let out a sharp hiss. The doors folded open with a heavy mechanical groan. Julian didn't rush inside. He collapsed heavily onto the very first step, his body completely devoid of the structural strength required to stand. He scrambled up the stairs on his hands and knees, dragging his form toward me like a pilgrim reaching a holy site. He radiated the scent of sweat, sour champagne, and pure terror. He lunged forward and grabbed my hand, his palm incredibly slick with cold sweat. "Dad," he wept, lowering his head until his forehead pressed directly against my knee. "I'm so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry. I was wrong. I was an absolute fool." I looked down at the top of his head. I noted the thinning hair he had desperately tried to conceal with an expensive cut, and the violent shaking of his shoulders. "I know you're sorry, Julian," I said evenly. "I know you are experiencing an immense amount of pain right now." He raised his head, a massive surge of desperate, hungry hope flooding his eyes. He believed he had discovered a crack in the armor. He thought he had successfully recovered the old father who used to sign the clearance forms and settle his parking infractions without question. "Do you forgive me?" he croaked, his voice raw. "You aren't going to abandon us, right? You heard what Clara said. We are entirely homeless, Dad. We have absolutely nothing left. You possess $12 million. You can rescue us. I can step in and manage the capital for you. I learned an incredible amount from Harrison. I know the business model was a fraud, but the financial mechanics behind it, I can master them. I can serve as your asset manager." I systematically pulled my hand out of his grip. He was still attempting to pitch a scheme to me. Even at absolute rock bottom, his instinct was to negotiate a corporate position. He didn't require a father. He wanted an investor. I reached deep into the inside pocket of my coat. I frequently keep small document envelopes there. I am a man who prefers to prepare for contingencies. Julian tracked the movement instantly, his eyes widening as he followed the trajectory of my hand emerging from the fabric. He spotted the white paper envelope, and I watched the calculations occurring behind his tear-filled eyes in real time. He assumed it was a bank draft. He believed it was cash, an immediate lifeline. "Here," I said, extending the envelope toward his form. "Thank you, Dad," Julian gasped, snatching the paper with a near-predatory speed. He fumbled frantically with the seal, tearing the paper completely open in his rush. "Thank you. I knew you wouldn't cast me aside. I knew you loved me." He extracted the contents. His smile froze instantly, then fractured, then died completely. It wasn't a check. It wasn't a stack of $100 bills. It was a single printed sheet of paper and a small rectangular transit ticket stub. Julian stared down at the items, turning the paper over to search for capital, shaking the envelope desperately in hopes that something else would fall out. Nothing did. "What exactly is this?" he whispered. I leaned forward, resting my elbows firmly on my knees, bringing my face directly into his field of vision. "Look at it, Julian. Read the print." He hoisted the ticket, his hand shaking so violently he could barely focus his eyes. "Amtrak," he read. "One way, to Williston, North Dakota." "Yes," I said. "The train departs from Penn Station in Manhattan in 2 hours. The airport line will take you straight there." "Williston?" he countered, the panic rising sharply in his voice. "Why North Dakota? I don't know a single soul out there." "Precisely," I said, pointing a finger at the sheet of paper in his other hand. "That document is a directory I compiled last night. It lists several industrial agencies in the Williston area that specialize in hiring non-skilled laborers for the Bakken Shale oil fields. It's hard labor, roughneck positions on the drilling rigs, equipment maintenance, pipe hauling. They don't require a resume. They don't care who your father is, and they don't look at your credit score. They only care if you show up on time and work until the whistle blows." Julian looked at the paper as if it were contaminated with a virus. You want me to work a drilling rig?" he gasped. "But I'm an executive. I am a vice president." "You're the vice president of an illusion, Julian," I said, my voice sharp and final. "In the material world, you are a 32-year-old man with 0 assets, 0 practical skills, and a pending fraud case attached to your name. You aren't an executive. You are a severe liability." I leaned back into my seat. "You stated you wanted to generate millions, Julian. You stood on that stage and mocked my existence. You called me mediocre because I labor with my hands, and you labeled me as the past." I pointed directly at the train ticket. "So consider this your future. If you are truly the visionary genius you claim to be, if you possess the drive to become a titan of industry, then the oil fields of North Dakota shouldn't intimidate you. Go out there, secure a position, rent a room, and save your capital. Build something completely real with your own 2 hands." "But I can't do that," he wailed. "I can't survive on an oil field. My hands are soft." "Then the calluses will teach you the meaning of respect," I said. He attempted to thrust the envelope back into my chest. "No! I reject this. I demand financial help. You possess 12 million. Just grant me 1 million. 1 single million. It represents absolutely nothing to your balance sheet." I grabbed his wrist, my grip closing like an iron clamp. It was the grip of a man who spent 40 years bending rebar and securing structural conduits. Julian winced under the pressure. "It represents absolutely everything to me, Julian, because I earned it. Handing you capital today wouldn't rescue you. It would destroy you. If I granted you $1 million right now, Howard or someone exactly like him would extract it from your pockets by tomorrow morning. You are a parasite, Julian. You have spent your entire life attaching yourself to a host. First me, then your mother, and then Harrison. You drain them dry and immediately begin scanning for the next vein." I pushed his hand firmly back into his own space. "I'm systematically disconnecting the host feed." "But I'll starve," he shrieked. "Clara will permanently leave me." "If she abandons you because your accounts are clear, then she never possessed any love for you," I said. "And if you starve, it will be because you refuse to consume the food you physically earned." I turned my head to face the driver. "Proceed," I said. The driver engaged the controls. The air brakes released with a heavy, resounding hiss. Julian realized the transfer was final. Scrambling backward down the steps in pure terror, to avoid being trapped by the closing doors, he hit the asphalt hard. He sat on the pavement, clutching the envelope and the one-way ticket tightly against his chest, because it was the single remaining asset he possessed in the world. "Dad!" he screamed one last time as the doors folded shut. "Don't do this to me." I didn't avert my gaze. I looked at him straight through the glass. I watched him stand there, wearing only one shoe, clutching a ticket to a brutal lifestyle. I spoke to him through the window, even though he couldn't hear a word. I'm not doing this to you, son. I'm doing this for you. The shuttle surged forward, its heavy diesel engine roaring. Julian managed to run alongside us for a few yards, but his stamina was entirely gone, and our momentum was too quick. He was instantly left behind. I watched him diminish in the distant side mirror. I saw him stop running. I saw him look down at the ticket in his hand. He was entirely alone. For the very first time in his 32 years of existence, he was completely, terrifyingly alone. And that is the single place where a man can truly rediscover his foundation. I turned my head away as the highway to the departures terminal opened up ahead, a long gray ribbon stretching toward the horizon. I pulled out my phone. I deleted his number. Then I deleted Eleanor's, then Clara's. I felt a brief vibration in my hand, an email from the lead architect in Portland. He had attached the initial blueprints for the new coastal villa I planned to construct. It faced the sweeping Atlantic, complete with a massive garden, a spacious study, and dedicated guest quarters for true friends. I opened the file. The rendering was bright, and the lines were clean. It looked exactly like peace. My name is Arthur Pendleton. I am 68 years old. I lost a family that never truly existed, but I secured a level of dignity that will never expire. As the shuttle accelerated toward the departures terminal, I realized the single greatest investment I had ever made wasn't my patent, and it wasn't my accumulated savings. It was that one-way Amtrak ticket I had just handed to my son. If he chooses to utilize it, he might actually survive. If he discards it, he will completely vanish into the world. But regardless of the outcome, the circuit has been successfully closed. The primary work is complete. I closed my eyes, letting the motion of the bus lull me into a quiet, deeply satisfying rest. Next stop, Maine. Next stop, my life. The flight back to Maine felt like the longest journey of my life. Not due to the actual distance, but because of the sheer weight of the history I was permanently leaving behind. I slept through the majority of the trip, releasing a deep, bone-deep exhaustion that had settled into my system. But the exact moment the wheels touched down on the tarmac at Bangor International, when I stepped outside and felt the sharp, unmistakable chill of the North Atlantic breeze against my skin, I felt the final set of shackles drop away. I secured a rental vehicle and made the drive back to Bar Harbor. The familiar scenery of coastal pines and jagged granite shelves brought a profound wave of tranquility. I pulled up to my cabin, slid the key into the deadbolt, and turned it. It moved flawlessly. No security codes to memorize, no biometric protocols, and no banking institutions threatening foreclosure. Just a simple mechanical lock, shielding a perimeter that belonged entirely to me. Inside, the air possessed a clean scent of lemon polish and the open ocean. My drafting boards and reference books rested precisely where I had left them. My armchair by the window sat waiting. I dropped my suitcase in the entryway, not even bothering to unpack, and walked straight over to the deck doors, pushing them wide open. The sun was beginning its descent below the horizon. The water resembled a sheet of hammered gold leaf, reflecting the dark silhouettes of the fir trees. In the distance, I could hear the low thrum of a lone lobster boat returning to the harbor. It was a solitary, striking sound, a testament to discipline in the open sea. I walked into the kitchen and opened a bottle of wine. It wasn't a $2,000 bottle of Bordeaux with a fraudulent vintage label. It was a $20 bottle of California Cabernet. I poured a glass and stepped back out onto the balcony, taking a slow sip. It tasted of rich earth, raw sunlight, and absolute truth. It was complex, robust, and entirely unpretentious. I sat there for hours, watching the natural light fade into the dusk. For years, I had harbored a deep anxiety about this exact scenario. I had been terrified of becoming an old, solitary man sitting on a deck by himself. Eleanor had constantly assured me that without her presence, I would degenerate into a pathetic, isolated hermit. Julian had told me that without grandchildren, my life would possess zero legacy. They were entirely wrong. True isolation isn't sitting comfortably on a balcony in Bar Harbor, with $12 million in a private account and a completely clear conscience. Isolation is sitting at a dining table surrounded by three people who are actively calculating how much your existence is worth to their lifestyle. Isolation is sleeping next to a woman who dreams only of a faster sports car. Isolation is pouring your life into a son who views you merely as a financial roadblock rather than a father. I am not isolated. I am simply unburdened. And there is a universe of difference between the two. My phone rang on the wooden table. It wasn't them. I had systematically changed my number the moment I touched down. It was an email from David, the forensic accountant at the SEC. He was finalizing his investigation folders, and he figured I might appreciate a concluding status report on the material disposition of the parties involved. I opened the document, reading through the metrics with a detached, clinical interest of an engineer reviewing an autopsy report on a bridge failure. Eleanor, my ex-wife, currently resides in a government-subsidized housing complex in South Boston. Because the Back Bay brownstone was hard-coded into the fraud and hard money lending syndicate, the authorities systematically liquidated every asset outside of basic bankruptcy exemptions. Her jewelry was seized, and her designer furs were sold at public auction. The capital she had frantically wired to Harrison was entirely untraceable, vanished into a labyrinth of offshore shell accounts that investigators are still attempting to decode. David noted that she had recently applied for a position as a checkout clerk at a high-end department store, the exact establishment where she used to burn through thousands of dollars a month. The geometric irony of it is absolute. She is now scanning barcodes for the exact demographic of women she used to compete with. I wonder if she ever thinks of my existence during those 8-hour shifts on her feet. I wonder if she remembers the man who used to massage her feet after a long day of work. Likely not. She is probably far too consumed with blaming the world for her misfortune, entirely convinced she is an exiled queen. Harrison, or rather Howard Fisk, was denied bail. The federal prosecutors are hit him with the maximum statutory charges: wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. Because he crossed state lines to execute the scam, the offenses sit at the federal level. He is facing a minimum threshold of 20 years in a maximum security facility. David attached his current mugshot. Howard isn't smiling anymore. Without the tailored Tom Ford suits, the rented Maybach, and the theatrical lighting, he looks incredibly small, just an aging, broken con man with absolute terror in his eyes. He spent his entire life manufacturing illusions, and now he will spend the remainder of his days staring at the very real concrete walls of a cell. And then there's Julian. The report on my son was brief. Clara filed for a total dissolution of the marriage exactly 3 days after the wedding disaster, citing irreconcilable differences. The standard legal terminology for the capital ran out. She relocated back to her parents' residence in Wisconsin and has already updated her social media profiles with images of a new companion, a local vehicle salesman. She moved with incredible speed. Parasites always do. Julian didn't contest the divorce. He possessed zero capital to retain legal representation. David tracked his location to a low-cost boarding house in Williston, North Dakota. He had boarded that train. He is currently working the night shift as a roughneck on an oil derrick. Brutal, back-breaking, exhausting physical labor. The exact kind of manual work he used to view with absolute contempt. The exact work I performed for 40 years to finance his very first vehicle. David noted that Julian occupies a single room with a shared communal bathroom, possesses no vehicle, and utilizes the corporate shuttle to access the oil fields. I set the phone down and took a slow sip of my wine. I felt a microscopic wave of sorrow for the little boy who used to sit on my shoulders, reaching up to try and touch the moon, but I suppressed it immediately. That boy is permanently gone. The man occupying that boarding house in North Dakota is a complete stranger. But perhaps, just perhaps, the weight of those iron pipes and the physical ache in his muscles will finally teach him the values I failed to instill. Perhaps in the absolute quiet of that small room, he will finally construct a shred of authentic character. Or perhaps he won't. Perhaps the weight will crush him entirely. But that is his private circuit to repair. I installed the necessary safety mechanisms, and I provided the essential directory. The daily maintenance is entirely up to him. I looked back out toward the open ocean. The distant lighthouse continued to flash its warning, a beacon far more stunning than any lead glass Eleanor had ever worn around her neck. I thought about the new villa I was preparing to build. I thought about my upcoming flight to Tokyo to coordinate the deployment of my seismic systems with Japanese engineers. I thought about the woodworking class I had just enrolled in. I realized that for the very first time in my 68 years of life, I am not living for the validation of another entity. I am not a provider, I am not a safety net, and I am not a walking financial institution. I am simply Arthur, and Arthur is completely satisfied. I finished the remainder of my wine as the sky shifted to a deep, velvety shade of purple. Rising from my chair, I walked over to the deck railing and took a deep breath of the crisp night air. I am not a man who harbors a desire for vengeance. I hold no malice toward them. I simply want them to experience the exact reality they earned for themselves. Every obligation is met, and the long journey is complete. Now I embrace the profound peace I worked a lifetime to achieve. The ledger is balanced, the warning lights are off, and the view from this foundation is absolutely spectacular. We frequently spend our entire lives constructing elaborate castles for individuals who wouldn't hesitate to liquidate the bricks the moment our backs are turned. I learned that true loyalty has absolutely nothing to do with blood. It is entirely a metric of character. My ex-wife and son chase the illusion of fast capital, only to lose the single authentic asset they possessed, a man who is willing to give absolutely everything for their security. At the end of the day, dignity is the single most expensive currency in existence. You cannot purchase it, you cannot counterfeit it, and once you trade it away to chase fool's gold, you can never afford to buy it back. Invest your time in yourself, and in the individuals who are willing to do the heavy lifting to build a real foundation. That is the only asset that will never depreciate. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever had to sever connections with toxic individuals just to preserve your own sanity, keep this lesson close to your heart. It will carry you further than you think. If you want to explore more accounts of structural resilience, integrity, and the ultimate arrival of accountability, stay independent and stay sharp. I have plenty of data left to share with you in the future. Let me know down in the comments. If you were holding the remote, would you have handed Julian that capital? Or did I construct the correct resolution? I review every single response. I'll see you in the next story.